Welcome back to the DemystifySci podcast. I'm Anastasia,
I'm Shiloh.
and this is the place where we search for the theories that are going to change the world. We started this project 5 years ago, and we named it DemystifySci because we really had this orienting principle, which was that we needed to spend a lot of time disentangling the influence of mysticism on things like fundamental physics. We saw that there was this really serious problem where the foundations of reality were difficult to understand, and instead of trying to understand them, they were being talked about in this really cloaked, mysterious, intentionally obscure way that seemed intended to confuse rather than to clarify. And so, at least for the first year, we were very, very extreme in this belief. It was like mysticism belongs here, science belongs here, never will the two meet together. But after almost 400 episodes, we've started to realize that there's something really weird about mysticism and human society and psychology, which is that there has never in the history of the planet been a society that has managed to flourish completely in the absence of mysticism. And so now we're stuck with this question of, okay, if it seems like mysticism is something that humans need, and it also seems like science is probably a fairly robust and useful way of encountering the world, what is the right balance that exists between the two of these ideas, the mystical and the ephemeral, and the materialist and rationalist approach that is the scientific method? And Shiloh has also been really concerned about the sort of overarching spiritual landscape around us right now.
Yeah, I think what's one of the biggest questions of our times right now is the spiritual void. I would go so far as to say we live in a fairly spiritually sick society where most people are suffering degrees of mental illness and loneliness and all sorts of malaises that have been unknown to people at this scale thousands of years in the past. And so the question becomes who's going to step in to address that? And there's two obvious answers to that question. One coming from the scientific techno-utopians who offer the idea that essentially rationality and the machine gods are going to step in to save us, and the other being a regression to the traditional mythological substructures of the past, which I would point out have utterly failed us as well, and that they tend to disinclude half the population. They're out of touch with the rapid technological acceleration that we are faced with, and really just the everyday life of young people in this modern Western civilization. So we're really, really cornered because we need something to rally around. We need a central axis that we can orient and agree with, a shared spiritual substructure moving into the future. And the question of our times is, what does that look like? There's ample precedent in the past for looking at how these spiritual transformations have occurred. And so today on the podcast, we're inviting an old friend who's actually a really, really fantastic biochemist, our friend Michael Hughes, to come by and talk to us about something that he and I and Anastasia have been discussing in the background all along, which is his fascination with esoteric traditions outside of superstructures that we associate with religions, and what we can learn from those as applied to the future of solving this question. What is that shared spiritual substructure that orients us in our science, that orients us outside of our science towards a world that we actually commonly do care to see manifest?
And by the end of the conversation, we don't necessarily arrive at a conclusion. But we do get to this question of whether or not a messianic vision is what is necessary for the future of society. And so I think that there's a place where this conversation will pick up down the line, because there's a lot of ink spilled on the topic of whether or not you can have a messiah that doesn't lead you astray, or whether it's even possible to have a society that lives without a main character. And so there's clearly more conversations to have on the table.
Main characters, perhaps. Yes, so if you enjoy what's going on here, maybe you have the piece of the puzzle that we're missing. And you could tell us all about it by signing up for this new segment we're doing called Paradigm Drift. Michael has actually been instrumental in making this happen over the first few episodes that we've done. I think he will be joining us more and more regularly as a panelist to unfold the process where you put your name in a hat and perhaps we call on you to enter into the meeting and tell us your idea. You only get 60 seconds to do it, but if you can intrigue us about it, perhaps we'll invite you back. And if you really knock it out of the park, maybe you will find yourself elaborating at length over 3 hours on this podcast about your particular solution to some problem in the world.
We are recording the next one with some friends that are visiting, and it's going to be on September 5th at 7 p.m. Pacific. So if you're available at that moment and you have your 60-second theory ready, sign up at the link in the description below.
Remember, guys, this project is entirely made possible by listeners directly. We're not selling anything. We are running this directly for you, and it's paid for entirely by you. Now, if you do decide to support the project, you also get a seat at the table, and that's really awesome because I would love to meet you. So you can come out, and we get together every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific. With our Sunday salon, we gather, we share ideas, and we're trying to figure out how we actually build a physical community that surrounds this kind of exploration that we are oriented towards with this project. So check it out. It's over at patreon.com/DemystifySci.
And with that, enjoy the conversation with Michael Hughes about the future of science, mysticism, and the Messiah.
The scientific revolution starts now.
The DemystifySci podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Scientists and the priests of old were trying to focus on prophetic visions, right? They're different brands of prophecy, but you have a lot of the same players, right? So one interesting piece of that is that oftentimes the people who are promoting and doing experimentation and working in laboratories are not necessarily the same people who have the creative insight, the vision, the prophetic idea of, oh my God, I think that this might be how blank works, right? It's often a swarm of people working on some pre-existing prophecy. And I think that that structure can be traced all the way back throughout the history of mysticism as well, where you have this priest class that inserts itself into harnessing some prophecy and then extracting value from it or organizing power bases around some initial revelation, which gets to the point that it's completely perverted and useless at some point. It's just institutionally gobbled up and diverted towards serving the elite base that the priests defend. And I think the same thing might be happening today, and we can get into the present a little bit later, but it might be happening in the sciences as well.
Agreed. And I do think that there is this kind of history when we look back, not just the history of religion, but of humans where, with religion, we have the Buddha and the stories that the Buddha has. And then there's still to this day, Buddhism offshoots, right? As you say, there's like this kind of prophecy, and then there's the people. Most of the people aren't the prophets. They're just kind of carrying on or working on this older project, right? And then after the Buddha, there's, you can name infinite number of religions, maybe like Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all these things stem. And in a sense, you have this, there's, for hundreds, if not thousands of years between these chapters, there was kind of a prophet class, and then there was the priest class that would disseminate this among the populace, right? And at certain points, there's all these things of these classes getting bloated and overpowerful, and revolution. And in kind of ancient history, there's evolution of kings and priest kings and vying for power. Slowly we get away from priest kings into actual kings, and they still have an interesting relationship from the church. And even to this day, we're still evolving these relationships. And science throws an interesting mix in too, as in kind of updating or evolving these beliefs as well. But yeah, there always seems to be this kind of prophet, this expansion of this power of this class of people and priests underneath it that begets to get bloated, and then another revolution happens or another prophet introduces an idea.
Yeah, and I think that a feature of the world that belongs in this discussion is the need for that priest class and the way that the priest classes and the dogmas go in and out of fashion. I think that the example that comes to mind most easily is probably the emergence of Christianity as the state religion in the Roman Empire. It's the one that I know the most about.
Which is hilarious because it developed originally, at least in the gospel sense, as this prophet guy rebelling against the authority of the priest class in the first place. But then after 400 years or so, it's turned into this officiated state religion.
And
Right.
it turns into we were talking about this yesterday. It seems like it turns into that because there's a generational turnover. There's by the time that 0 AD comes around, I feel like the old pagan religions are not really taken that seriously. It's sort of lip service. It's the idea that nobody really thinks that Zeus is living on Mount Olympus anymore. They're mythological stories that play a part and they play a role, but I don't think that they're explicitly believed as being true. And so there's this transition that has to happen where as the old belief systems become less robust in their sense of reality, something new has to come in that is
Right.
more trustworthy. And so it seems like that's what we're living through right now, which we've been talking about a lot, which is this idea that the old historical religious frames, people are trying to revive them and they're trying to bring back Christianity and Catholicism and all of these old.
Buddhism, Eastern stuff.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't think that those are going to catch because I think that there is this sense in people's minds where it's like it's not possible to take those things literally.
Right.
And so the next era is an era where we have something that we can take literally. And so science kind of comes into that place where it's like, well, this is something that you can take literally because it is a rational way of dealing with the world. And it is the most accurate way that we have of being able to parse these things.
New Messiah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And so it really does feel that way. And it ties back into this idea of the UFOs too, because it feels like the UFOs are the embodiment of the scientific technological worldview coalesced into some kind of being that stands as the symbol. Like Shiloh's been obsessing over this question of like, what is the symbol that stands for the new age? Who is the character? What are the pieces of apocrypha that people carry around and they, count the rosary beads? I think that it's like science and UFOs.
Well, I'm going to make the case eventually. I don't know if we need to get there right this second, but I do want to work towards this. But I think I want to make the case eventually that that is a false symbol. It is a false
Mm,
prophet. It
It's a dead
is.
end.
It's just regressive at the bare minimum.
really?
But we can. We don't. I mean, we can go there right now. But I think that it might be more interesting to talk a minute about the attempts to unify science and spirituality over the years, the maybe just some bare evidence for the fact that people can't shake their need for this, even the scientists along the way. Maybe you can comment some on that. I know you sent us
Yeah.
a huge list of world leaders who are, you know,
Yeah.
esoterically possessed, and yeah.
Let's lay that out for a second. And so I think that Anastasia really like lays out really nicely where this like road goes and how we get there. I think that Anastasia, you start with a really, really interesting point in time of like the transition from pagan beliefs to Christian beliefs. And there's like two parts that I kind of want to like revisit. One that you mentioned, like the frame of mind of people not really believing in the myths anymore. I'm not sure if I see it in that way as much as I think that actually comes a little bit later where we start to like question our myths. I think that kind of comes more towards the Renaissance when we really start to like, question this stuff. And I only say that because I kind of think that science is that instrument that allows us like a different lens to question it. And before it was not really another lens available. It was kind of like prophecy from above. It was the priests. It was these class, right? But the issue of why would Christianity catch on so take over an entire continent in such a short frame of time. And so when we were talking earlier about this bloated priest class, you can imagine that the pagan way of doing religion involved a lot of ritual sacrifice, a lot of stuff that where clearly the priest can be utterly abusing this, right? And so think of a group of people that are so discontented with the status quo of the priest class that as soon as the instant message of a guy who was kind of a pacifist who died on a piece of wood comes around, that people just like glom onto this. This is a really interesting development, right? So I think it kind of speaks to this tragedy of the bloating of the like past class, where then this helps to usher in this new way because people are looking for something new to hold on to when the old one becomes, dominating. And maybe like in a sense, we feel that today with the church by the 1400s is dominating every aspect of life, right? Telling what you can and can't do, all these kinds of things. So again, this other bloated priest class that is kind of dictating things. And so ripe time for the concept of natural science to come along. And science isn't out of nowhere, right? Like science is a split from religion. In a sense, astrology is the original astronomy, right? Like the scientists and the technicians and the priest class of the past time were very much employed in the measurement of the heavens and measurement in general, like building, organizing, right? These kinds of things. So science is a natural offshoot from what religion in a sense built, right? So the scientists, the natural scientists, are kind of like 1800s. They're all Christian, right? They're coming from these educated, scholarly backgrounds.
I heard Rudyard from What If Aldous make a really interesting case about this astrology aspect and how the way I interpreted this was that it's a great example of what happens when you mix up science and mysticism. And he points to the Mesoamerican civilization as an archetypical representation of this, where you have this obsession with time, right? Particularly the Mayans, their astronomy, they're watching the heavens, they're trying to predict the cycles of nature. And he actually points, I think, to, if I recall correctly, he points to the El Nino cycles, which dominate the weather patterns in a very catastrophic way. So despite the fact that we think of Mayan civilization as occurring in this jungle, it's actually extremely arid there. I don't know where the hell those trees are getting their water from. I assume it's from some porous, like low-lying water tables. And so he basically says that, what happens is when you have these priests who are both on one hand studying the skies and trying to predict the cycles that will befall their civilization, and you also have those same people trying to placate who they see as an external actor governing this, these gods in the heavens who need blood really bad, that it's all well and good in a good cycle. So when you're on the upswing, you're getting that nice, humid air, you're getting the rain, killing people, sacrificing them, throwing them into the cenotes is totally fine. But then what happens is when you keep doing that and it's not working out, the civilization completely loses faith in its priest structure, and you have these very regular revolutions where these city-states rise and fall because people have a lot of faith in the institutions, the priest class. When it's going well, they'll go along with the sacrifice. And then as soon as things, the natural cycles start to, even if you can predict them, the problem is you're attributing it to this external actor, and you think that you know what that external actor wants. And so while you're very, very empirical, and this is kind of ties us into the modern world too, you can be really, really empirical and have incredibly precise models for how things work. But if you point to a cause which is irrational, superstitious, and this is happening today, we can get into the different ways in which this is happening, you could misplace the cause in such a severe way that not only do you get it wrong and screw over your chance at abating disaster, but you also lose the faith and the trust of the people in that institution, which was in many ways on the right track, like in some empirical sense on the right track. But the confusion of the mystic and the rational leads the entire enterprise off the cliff.
Totally. And so this confusion of the mystic and the rational is really curious to me because when I first started to enter into this field or just thinking about these concepts deeply, I entered as a scientist where I thought that our predictions, like my models that I make to predict an outcome, predict what a system will do, is in a sense like predict the future so that I can exercise some control over it. Because ultimately, I don't want you to get cancer. I don't want your cells to become right. I want something to happen, and I want to exercise control over that. This is like the human tendency that we're familiar with now. But I argue that through human history that we may have had a slightly different relationship with prophecy, not as much as a future to overcome, but kind of as a warning for like confrontation is inevitable, right? You will confront something, and it's not telling you how that confrontation will end. It's just guaranteeing that it's going to come. And so in a sense, the older frame of thought would be surrendering to prophecy. You use astrology to divine from the stars what, in a sense, you kind of should be doing right now, not to overcome it, but just to know your place in the cycle. Right? And so, yeah, like the Greek Antithecarica mechanism, right? This fancy copper computer found at the bottom of the ocean, right? The highest science of our history was devoted to this astrology, to looking at this. And so how would a ruler use this information, right? Now, clearly, the ruler is probably pretty human, probably wants what they want. They want to win. They want the outcome that they want. So they're going to like be employing the astrologer with this in mind. But the astrologer might have a completely different view of what this means to them as a mystic, right? So there's this rational, I want to control things. And then there's the mystic element of, well, this prophecy might serve a different purpose. It might tell you what you're here to be doing as opposed to what should be the outcome. And so, but nonetheless, given that throughout human history, we've had this really intimate relationship of the ruling class with a mystical or prophet class, right? There's the oracle at Delphi back in the Greeks. There's Rasputin in the Russian hierarchy. American presidents, I think Abe Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, they all had wives that were very deeply into astrology and different, usually like Eastern arts as well. If we think of Oppenheimer, I Become Shiva, were very well read with ancient Indian texts. If you look at CERN, right, and also almost all of the fathers of quantum, like Maxwell, these people are really, really also have a lot of some of what we consider non-material mystical beliefs when they're interpreting their information as well. And so you see statues at scientific places like CERN of Shiva, right? We see these things, these ruling classes do not necessarily completely distance themselves from this kind of mysticism. So even though a president might purport to be doing rational policy, arguably they're just a hand, right in the same room, there's a mystic that they might be talking to. And we don't know on the inside what is driving their decision, but we're going to hear rational, we're going to hear economics, science, policy, right? But in their heart, they might be hearing something else, right? They might be making this decision based on what we call like a cult level, right? And so there's overt and occult. Occult only means hidden, right? Overt is, or it's like what's happening on the outside, and occult is what you keep to themselves. So in a sense, the occult reasoning behind our decisions is what we kind of keep to ourselves. And that's not all of, right? So our leaders are giving us a rational explanation, but it may not be what they're actually thinking.
I had no idea that there was a statue of Shiva at CERN. It's pretty cool.
Oh, sorry. One of the threads that binds all these together is that in each of these cases, it seems like the priests and the leader classes want to contain the prophecy, and they're not giving a microphone to the seance leader at the White House, right? So the priests themselves, even in the history of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is the one I'm most familiar with as far as religions go, the priest class in general is working really hard to contain the prophecy and the necessity of the what would you say, parishioner, the public, the person, to reach into the higher level, right? So aside from like some mystery traditions, Gnosticism, these like kind of sidelined approaches where you have direct experience with the transcendent. For the most part, when the priests get involved, they're trying to actually keep that prophecy in a little box that they can like open up and look into every once in a while, and then go back to things. And so as we work towards an ideal future integration of both of these elements, I feel like there's an obvious piece of the puzzle which gives the power back to the individual to elevate themselves with respect to some central metaphysical axis that serves them without having to rely on somebody who's going to close the box on their fingers every time they get close to it.
So this is a really interesting thing, right? Because the ideal that I think you're painting is a society where there is no priest class. Is that accurate?
I don't know. I'm going to think about that as we continue. I mean, I think we should start. I think we shouldn't jump to imagining the future quite yet, because I want to make sure that we have space to look at the ways in which the modern scientistic religion has failed to be progressive, despite the fact that it believes and toots its own horn that it's so progressive. Like, I want to make the case, or at least develop our understanding of that current situation. And as a good example, maybe we can talk about Avi Loeb for a second.
Oh, hold on. Yeah. Well, hold on. I wanted to make a point about like priest classes in society.
Yeah, maybe we're not ready to go there yet. That's fine too.
My point is that I don't think that there has ever been a society that has managed to not have some kind of external supernatural structure. Like, anthropologically speaking, that doesn't exist. There's no place where you can go to in history and point to a critical mass of a society that has no supernatural or mystical experiences. Like, if you start looking this up, people will point to the Stoics or the Epicureans, and there's these like philosophical periodic blebs that manage to persist through history long enough that we have their texts, but it's not a critical mass of people. Like, there's not an overwhelming majority that decides to eschew the entire religious structure. And I think that that's a pretty interesting feature of this, because it seems like what we are living through now in modernity is this, on one hand, attempting to erase the supernatural structures, and on the other hand, being confronted by the fact that we have absolutely no idea how to do that, because we've literally never managed to accomplish it before.
Yeah. So I agree with all this. And so the first question that comes to mind for me is like, what does this supernatural structure do for us? Why is it at the root of all of these histories, right? What is it doing for us? And so I think that, right, these are stories, these are mythologies, and within this, there's baked information, the bare minimum, right? And so what is the intention of these? And I think a reasonable answer is that it's kind of like a parent, right? It's to educate what you're here, what you're doing, and what's kind of like, it can even be what the goals are. It can be what the goals aren't. I think that embedding a lot of this mythology is kind of the human experience and what's happening. So
my instinct is that
yeah.
it's also partially cultivating good fortune, right? Because
In
you
what way?
you live in a world where things just happen. Sometimes the rains stop, sometimes earthquakes come, sometimes there's tsunamis, sometimes fire falls from the sky. And you know that it happens. There's myths of it happening, sometimes you see it happen. And so I think that the mythological structures are in some way a pleading with the universe to say that, look, there is something that is out there where if we are sufficiently devoted to it, that we will be protected from the vagaries of nature. That terrible event will not befall us because we perform the rituals correctly, we structure our society correctly, we act correctly, and we will be protected. And so it is kind of like parental in some sense.
Right. I think that's completely fair. And why I invoke parental is kind of exactly like what a child should do when they don't know anything and are fearful is like go find a parent. Ask if you don't know something, ask a question, right? And so, in a sense, the priest is this parent, right? In our human history, you have this where you have this want, you have this question, and you go to the parent, and then they, from the prophecy, kind of translate to you. They're the middleman of that. But in a sense, both the prophecy and the priest are kind of being your parents here, right? You're not really answering it yourself. So what is like curious is that in Steiner's cosmology and esoteric Christianity is that there's this inflection point where at a natural point, you can't, right, as a 30-something-year-old, I should not necessarily be calling my parents for help every time. There's a natural evolution that the human needs to go through where you start to take that responsibility onto yourself. And so in esoteric Christianity, the entire world is, in a sense, and the universe is a school designed to teach. And in a sense, you have to become independent, just like you do here. And part of this independence naturally involves not listening to a priest class, in a sense, or becoming your own priest, perhaps, or disempowering, or doing something different where this power dynamic changes to one where you can do this internally in yourself. And there's like several parables about this, I think, in that this is also kind of like a Promethean type story where Prometheus is chained to a rock for giving humans fire, and fire represents this ability of like this free will and this technology aspect where we can start to make our decisions for ourselves. In another framework, from the Christian framework, from my understanding of Rudolf Steiner's description of the mystery of Golgotha, would be, or actually, maybe we should get to that one later. I feel like that's this interesting. Steiner has a really interesting play on the difference between like materialism and mysticism through his story of Golgotha. That's kind of interesting. It's like emblematic as we start to. So before in pagan times, you perform a sacrifice because it's an external act, right? You do the blood ritual, and all these things are kind of outside you. Or when in the story of John the Baptist, Jesus Christ is baptized, right? You have this rite performed on you. And this is external. This requires a parent, this requires a prophecy, this requires a priest, right, to do all these things on you. So you really require this external, like material kind of process for that. The idea that Steiner described is baked into the mystery of Golgotha, of the resurrection of Jesus Christ when he was entombed in this cave in the hill of Golgotha, which is shaped like a human skull. If you're a materialist and you want this ritual performed on you for resurrection, you might have to go to find the mountain of Golgotha, right? That hill. You have to read the text. You have to go to that place, and so you mount a crusade to go do this, right? And you try and find this like material place for this. But another way of reading the same story is that Jesus Christ was resurrected in this hill shaped like a skull. So it's invoking the skull. So he was resurrected inside the human mind. And so from the mystical and not the like rational material point of view, from a more like rational mystical view, it was within Jesus's Christ's mind, he himself resurrected himself through his inner work as opposed to an external work. And this is kind of what we're supposed to do is ushered in by this, according to Steiner, is this transition to where we take responsibility for ourselves and that we do our own inner work as opposed to have an exterior rite performed on us by a priest class to bail us out of our problems. Right? And so there becomes this natural thing where the previous powerful priest class that held everything kind of becomes corrupted because it becomes out of time. Right? If you baby your child too long, it doesn't work. Right? These kinds of things. So there's a natural transition where the old way of doing things is no longer suitable for the new way of doing things. And I think that we see this all the time, even just in evolution of human society as well, right? This is happening at a pace more rapid than ever.
As you're talking, I'm trying to triangulate where I read this, which was that like the seed of a successful belief structure is getting somebody to accept something that is impossible and to kind of go along with the story. Like I cannot remember the author, but they were pointing to the Eucharist. where it's a ritualistic consumption of a wafer and wine that in that moment is the actual body of Christ.
I thought you were going to bring up the Big Bang, but go ahead.
I mean, that applies, but I think that's where it naturally goes to, right? So I wish I could remember the author. I was just trying to ask chat about it, but it doesn't know. But the principle was that everybody in the room recognizes that this is not the body of Christ. And yet there is this communal agreement that ritualistically what is happening is the consumption of the body, and everybody agrees upon it. And it's really, really important to maintain that kind of fragile state of suspended disbelief as a function of drawing people into the center of the belief structure. And Shiloh, you're going to lead this into the kind of the modern age, right? Because that's what the Big Bang comment was about.
Yeah, I mean, this is a hard conversation to have because, on one hand, we're talking about these historical patterns of religion and priests, but at the same moment, most people in our society today, I don't know if most listeners of this show, so I'm not trying to talk down to you guys because I know most of you are probably well beyond this, but it seems like most people in society treat science like it is actually beyond these things that we're talking about. It's beyond, and that's why I brought up the Big Bang, because it's another one of those cases. And I don't know if it was Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson or one of these jokers who said, I think maybe it was Terence McKenna, give me one miracle and I can explain everything in the universe to you, right? So even modern science has this foundational impossibility at the beginning, which is the something from nothing story of the Big Bang, which we've, obviously beaten to death on this show. If you haven't heard us beat it to death, just search cosmology on this channel. But I think that the UFO space does tie us back into this, right? Because in some sense, it is people trying to say, hey, well, there is some impossible phenomenon occurring, and we can apply modern science to it. And this seems to be what even brought you as a scientist into this realm in the first place, which sounds like you kind of had this 180, where you realized that, wait a second, the symbolic substructure itself is valuable without trying to actually put some modern scientific, technological, materialist explanation to these experiences people are having.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and nicely into why it's very strange for me as a scientist to come up here and share an interpretation about a parable of Jesus Christ, right? 4 or 5 years ago, I don't understand this moment. And so what is strange is that right, let's say there are UFOs in the government cabal to keep me from the truth, right? What do I do with that? People would say fight it or something like that, right? Again, seize your destiny, change the prophecy, just with that information, you can fight it. And what is strange and utterly confounding is that for me, through this journey and hearing these parables, I actually found much more meaning, right? I don't take much meaning in figuring out that I've been bamboozled by my government. And I feel that's kind of a slow unveil that's been happening to everyone right now, right? It's actually the status quo is probably what we should be learning right now. But then I took a lot more meaning of really this idea of prophecy as not an enemy to overcome or something to achieve, but as telling you where you are in time. And it's my place in time to be confused. And all these stories are really helpful with that confusion, because all these stories are actually, in a sense, the human stories, the oldest human stories, right? So I think that there's this desire that I had to throw away all of the old human stuff that I don't understand from these weird people talking about angels and things that just don't show up in everyday life. And then we can build a new cosmology based on science with this UFO technology and finally understand how it all fits together. And the reality was I actually did the opposite in a sense.
Robot angels.
Exactly. It's our future, right? It could be. And so what was really interesting was all these stories had so much meaning baked into them, because in a sense, the Western education I grew up in is very, very young. It's a few hundred years of some rigorous history, maybe a couple thousand years of some less rigorous history. Chinese culture is thousands of years of unbroken history, right? It's very different. And so we have this like interesting point of view as a Westerner in a sense. We're kind of just like, I just like showed up, like people are doing this. I don't inherit this kind of history. So it's nice to think I can invent a new one, just see what's around and make my new story. And I think that's what a lot of scientists are trying to do, especially with the UFO stuff, is we can throw out all the old and just come up with our new cosmology that fits the data. But I argue that there's actually a lot of meaning in this history of seeing these human stories, right? The religion is really just a story of human consciousness and evolution through time that we've kind of kept and curated. And to see that there's darkness there, but also there's some useful stuff there, right? It talks about the same kind of things that scientists are interested in. Why are these things so intertwined? Because they're asking the same really deep fundamental questions about the universe. It seems so natural that I'd actually be drawn to an institution that's been trying to answer this for a long time, and claims it has answers too.
I mean, I think there is some portion of the population, and maybe every single one of them subscribes to this podcast already. No, there is some portion of the population like you that can do the Superman task of creating your own mythological substructure and orientation towards some ideal axis of internal progress. I think there's always been those people, and in all honesty, like the mystery schools have celebrated that. Gnosticism I mentioned earlier. I'd love to get back to Gnosticism, by the way, but some people are gonna be able to do that. But for the most part, a lot of people really want to have somebody tell them what's up, and the scientists have accepted that job in our modern world. They have accepted the job of telling people what's up. The problem is they're not really equipped to things like should, like the concept of what should be the future. The technologists are no more up to the tasks, and a lot of people confuse science and technology anyways, so we may as well just treat them as the same bunch, right? So the institutional academic priest class is not so much oriented towards what sorts of technology should we be building. They're just like trying to recruit all of the eggheads that they can to solve ever increasingly technically complicated problems. And the workers, the eggheads, are super stoked to solve problems. But the institution itself, the scientific technical institution, does not seem to be cut out to the job of orienting people towards anything approximating this internal axis that needs to be cultivated within each individual in order to actually have the insight to design technologies that make one's life actually more in line with the human project, as opposed to just derailing us into this deluded sense that, we can build a gizmo and make ourselves happy with it.
Right. I agree completely. I think that there is, you mentioned this idea of like the word should. Science doesn't really have the word should in it. And I think that's really powerful in that what was interesting to me about diving into all these old stories about humanity is that it kind of, there's different interpretations of all these stories. So I often use like a Steiner interpretation, and that's my personal like education and background choice. But you'll see that the themes are common in every like deep study of all these religions, right? They're all retelling of similar themes. So, but the thing is that should is like a big part of the concepts of these stories. And I think should is like a really human element. And so before, the Earth was the center of the solar system, it was really centering the human experience in the solar system. But then science comes along and, arguably like gets it right that the sun's the center. But at the same time, there's something that is maybe lost, that is the human experience still that should be centered. And so technology and science gives us another lens, in a sense, how to bind our it should be in a sense how to free ourselves from the shackles of these prophets, right? We can discover that the church elders aren't right, and we can make our own judgments from then. But the thing is that what we shed with that is maybe this history of what we should be doing. And I think that's kind of curious too for me, is that why I think that these old stories do have some use to them is that it does bake in this idea of a longer human project just inherently in them, and that we're part of that. And so for science to come along and throw away all of that and just start over with inventing what the new human project is, it seems right now that the zeitgeist is to leave the planet. right? It's interesting, or that we're worried about dying, right? And so again, the zeitgeist is a fear of death. It is a worry about resurrection. It's like this deepest like Jungian archetype at the center of humanity. It's very strange how scientists now starts to adopt the same problems that the religion was trying to help people with, which is like a fear of death and releasing yourself from that.
Problem is, it's just so alienating to like half the population, right? In some sense, I see this as the core political divide, right? That's just not appealing. Like going off to Mars is not going to appeal to a good portion of the population. Like these prophetic solution sets are just, they don't work for a lot of people, right? Like you're going to like sacrifice yourself to environmentalism doesn't work for a lot of people. That that humans are bad for the planet doesn't work for a lot of people. That that we're going to engineer our way out of death doesn't work for a lot of people who see the cycles of generation as fundamentally important in the evolution of our species, and actually as an axis that spirals upwards. It just seems like a little bit of a failed motif. And my worry, I probably should have said this right at the beginning, but the one thing that I'm like most worried about in the whole world is that we can't get by without some sort of shared spiritual mythos. And yet, the only people advocating for shared spiritual mythos are completely deranged as far as I can tell. Like on one side, they're completely regressive and they're appealing to these old world religions that are completely out of touch with the modern milieu. And on the other side, they're completely deranged because they're advocating this crazy techno escapism, which is equally bankrupt, but in the opposite direction. And I don't think like we can get by as a civilization without something better than either one of those options.
Well, to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, I think there's a really stringent requirement for some source of truth in the world. It's like I think that cultures, like Michael was saying, there is this sense of an appeal to an authority that will tell you what to do at any given moment. And so there's no way for us to escape that because no one goes through life without being occasionally uncertain and having to ask the question of, man, what do I do in this terribly difficult circumstance? And so,
Right.
on some level, the ability to trace cause and effect multiple iterations out, which is the promise that science makes, right? There's so much folded into it about being able to predict. You have a model that tells you about what's going to happen in the future. It is the epitome of this ultimate place where you can put your faith. Because it is not presumably, theoretically, ideally, it's not a supernatural belief structure where you're appealing to some bearded figure living on a mountain throwing thunderbolts. You're collecting data and you have priors and probabilities, and so you understand how these different networks fit together. And so you're like, okay, so if I disturb this thing here, then this is going to happen, and I want this other thing to happen, and so this is how I have to structure the chain of cause and effect in order to get where I want to go. And I think that in some ways it makes sense that you would have that at the center of your society.
But so did the Mayans, I guess is my point. Right? So I'm like, you can be really empirically accurate and identify patterns and even know how they're going to affect you. But then somebody is going to say, and probably a priest in either the academy or wherever, and throughout history you are with the priests, somebody's going to step in the case of the Mayan priests, and be like, well, yeah. And so this terrible cycle is swinging back in the other direction. It's not going to be good. What we got to do is cut some more hearts out. That'll fix things. And I see that kind of thing happening today as well, where what we got to do is get off this planet as quick as possible. What we got to do is have less humans around. Like these really creepy, like offhanded comments, because there's no tradition of should. There's no shared mythological substructure in science like that. there's nothing to orient those people who are making those declamations oriented towards the reality of what actually works out for people and what doesn't.
Okay, so I think that there is something interesting here, which is that it's really hard to know what's going to work out and what isn't. And inside of an evolutionary search space, if you assume that the time is not a flat circle, it is a spiral, where things do kind of cyclically recur in various patterns, but their circumstances are sufficiently different that it's not like you're going back to some old version of things. You now have this different circumstance upon which some reproducible or repeatable historic force will act, and so this sounds very spooky, but the forces that act upon a moment are repetitive, but the moment itself is not, and so you have different outcomes based off of what those forces are, or based off of what the circumstances are when the force is applied. And so you can look at like the repetitive collapse of civilization, and you can say, okay, so the Mayans collapsed because they placed too much faith into a priesthood, and the priesthood couldn't actually predict the weather or change it, and so they started sacrificing more and more people, and all of a sudden that subverts the will of the people because they're like, well, wait a second. If you sacrifice me and everything is going to go really well, I'm totally down for it, but you're sacrificing people that I really like and things aren't going well, and so maybe you don't actually have the mandate of heaven anymore. And so it's like, obviously none of the circumstances can be exactly translated onto the modern day, but I think that what you're saying is correct, which is that there's all of these things that are folded in as part of scientific practice that seem to suggest that if you have fewer children, if you consume less, if you drive less, if you do all of these things, the world will get better, and the world isn't getting better, and so all of a sudden there's this turmoil of like, well, hold on a second, how do we reconcile the fact that you've been telling us to do all of these things, but when we do them, they don't actually make things better? And so I think that that's kind of the similar force across time.
And on the other hand, and on the other side from that, like outside of like on the other side, you have like regressive barbarians being like, just accept the old world religions and like put the women in the kitchen and like everything will go back to being hunky-dory. And it's like, that's equally retarded too, in my opinion.
Yeah. And so I think that there's something that would like developer will fall naturally from this, but and Anastasia left off with this idea of like, oh, we'll do things, why like we're doing all the things that we're told, why isn't like working out? And so the first kind of idea is that this idea that you talked about, evolutionary sort of space being a spiral, this is a deep, also kind of like esoteric and occult theme, which is surface level on the universe. So now everyone is talking about things like fractal edge of, you know, like everything. But the idea that how the universe just seems to work is layering a bunch of cycles on top of each other, and randomly you get flukes, right? Sometimes things add up strangely, and it's very crazy. So we're always repeating the same kinds of struggles, but there's little details that change, and we try and get to new places based on this. But like there's a series of like core concepts and ideas that are these cycles that we're always going on. And so from there, the universe is, you know, trying to find like newness by new recombinations of these same cyclical patterns. But what we're up against today, it seems, is this: we've been doing these things and it hasn't been working out. So I really love this story of the invention of the origin of a tractor, right? A tractor was promised to farmers as you only have to work 2 hours a day, right? And so it's this beautiful Promethean invention. It gives the fire directly of like overcoming the physical environment directly into your hands to make your crops, you know, you can plant more, you can be more safe, do all these things. And what used to take you 8 hours a day of doing, you can do in 2 hours or 15 minutes. Farmers don't work 2 hours a day, right? Super hard workers on the tractor, way more than 2 hours. That was a lie by businessmen up above to sell tractors. But what we brought with us when we bought into those tractors was we brought the same practices. We didn't like free the person to plant what they wanted when they wanted. We like, they're still tied to this economy that demands more out of them. So as we've been given technology, we've also been demanded not the same output, but at more output. So it kind of, in a sense, like doesn't free our time. It does less for us. So what we've been given all this technology, but we still find ourselves like imprisoned by this ruling class in a sense, right? So it's not technology that frees us.
Well, we're also still imprisoned by nature itself, right? So on my last guiding trip, there was a woman who was a farmer, and they grow mostly hay and alfalfa at this point. And she was saying how sometimes she would be out on the tractor in the middle of the night. And I was like, why? That seems crazy. Like, surely there's a more convenient way to do it. And she said that you have to harvest alfalfa with the dew. And so when you bale alfalfa, it has to be still, there's something in the plant that responds to the cooler night temperatures, and it starts to produce dew so that when you bale it, it doesn't just turn into this dry mess. And if you water it, there's no way for you to water it just the right amount for it to not rot. And so basically there's this constant tension between what the technological promise is, what the social promise is, right? So the technological promise, the tractor is the Promethean presentation of fire to the person. The social promise is you'll only work for 2 hours a day. And then there's the constraint of nature itself, which is like, no, there's not really a way of getting around the fact that the cycle of the living, breathing things that you're working on demands a certain type of labor from you. And so I think that there's also something in here too, which is that the promise of the priest class in some ways has changed from being that we are subservient to nature to being capable of possessing and surpassing nature. And yet we find ourselves so deeply limited by that. And I think that the scientific promise is the promise that we can control all of nature at all times and do whatever we want, whatever we can dream up.
It's a fine line, right? I think we could get into the Luciferian Aramaic, help me say that word, Michael.
Aramonic.
Yeah, there's a balance that has to be treaded during the pursuit of progress, which it seems like modern science has, in this example, for instance, has overstepped. And there's ample mythological substructure to behold this. I mean, the fact that like, oh, you're gonna have all this time back, that'll be great. But like, I have a really good friend who has a great paying job and he only works a few hours a day and he's freaking miserable because like the work sucks and it doesn't have any connection to it in terms of like building the society that he wants to see happen. And so like, again, this single-minded like promise of, oh, well, what you need is time. It's like, well, maybe that's not actually what you need. Maybe what you need is to be oriented towards a future with your labor that's actually in line with your own spiritual transcendence as an individual. And if everybody was doing that, wow, what would that look like?
Does this like open up a can of worms about like the nature of work and the sort of the teleological purpose of humans? Like, is our function to just do stuff? And is the reason that these promises of 2 hours of labor a day a failure because the farmer can't actually bring themselves to work just 2 hours a day because that's kind of anathema to the identity of farmer?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of like an arc here that's proposed, right? So first of all, like our relationship with work and reality is kind of curious because from like, in a sense, a Buddhist perspective is one where you realize that everything is kind of an illusion and doesn't exist. And so how are you motivated to do work then? Right? Like it's nice you've like overcome that, but it seems like a lot of what people take is kind of like they're just in a sense waiting to die or like go back to true spirit. And this doesn't get you very far, right? So in a sense, there has to be an evolution. And then that Christianity is very like bought into works on the earth. And I think that Luther, right, or like Protestantism or good works is literally a part of a major Christian branch in the same age. I won't be able to like place it. But so buying into the illusion is a very big part of this. And this involves like your work here isn't meaningless, right? Your time here isn't just waiting it out. It means something. You have to do something with this. So it implies that with your time and your work, that it does matter, and you should be like building towards something. So again, what should we be building towards is then this like vacuous question, right? We're told like things that we should do. We shouldn't kill, we shouldn't steal, we shouldn't do all this, but it doesn't really tell us how to do that, right? It doesn't tell you how to live your life so that you don't have the urge to kill. It doesn't tell you how to live your life so that you don't need to steal. And in a sense, it's like on us to figure out. Before maybe there was like a priest class that could help us out, but I'm not familiar with that. I have to figure out with these things myself. And so I think this idea of like, strangely, what we're freeing ourselves though is a mixture of like we want to free ourselves from the tractor, but really what we're trying to free ourselves is the structure that puts us on the tractor, right? The washing machine saves us hours and hours of laundry a day. So whereas hundreds of thousands of years ago, we would be working so much to just get by. There's not much time for meditation, deep inner introspection there, right? Through the work, you can do that some, but to make this progress that a lot of times nowadays, like frankly, my experience at grad school is I didn't have a lot of time to think about the world until I was hired as a graduate student, right? Most of science is just a history lesson. You never actually like really do experiments that are generating novel data for humanity until you get to graduate school. The thing about graduate school is I paid like nothing and I have infinite time, right? It's basically the equivalent of being a monk, right? I just get to hang out in the convent and think strange thoughts for a while and see where I make it with that. That's like what a washing machine and a tractor should be buying you, right? Is you have to do fewer chores a day so you can like think more to like make it past these things that we're struggling with today. And this is what Steiner presents as a useful use of technology, is something that frees you up spiritually to pursue your spiritual quests in a sense. But there's also another way where technology can be used to dominate and to trap people, right? And so like you get a tractor, but you also get a system where you have to be on that tractor far more than you can ever, you would never be able to meditate and introspect with how much you have to work with this technology. And so that's kind of where we're at now, is we have all this technology that in a sense could be freeing us from the work we do every day, but there's something that's imprisoning us with it there and trapping us.
Shiloh, can you link this back to this Luciferian thing?
Yeah, let's get there. I do want to push back though, just because somebody in the audience is like eating their hand or whatever it is. They're freaking out. The case has been made by like Graeber and others that people didn't actually work that much in the past. And if you go to these, tribal hunter-gatherer societies today, they actually have a tremendous amount of free time, and they don't seem to experience boredom the same way that we do. Today, like you take a phone away from a 12-year-old and they have to stand in line at the grocery store, like they're going to have like a complete mental breakdown oftentimes, right? And I'm not saying
that immediately. I surrender to your point immediately. I'm more so like, what lifestyle is your friend who's like working 2 hours and hours all the time? Like they're miserable, right?
It's a misery that pervades though, right? It's not like he doesn't have time for his hobbies and all that shit. It's like he's fine, and on some sense he's making so much money and he's got a beautiful family, and like it's not a bad life, I guess. So I want to be really careful to not throw the baby out with the bathwater and not say like I'm advocating for some regression, despite the fact that these tribal hunter-gatherer societies have a lot of time. I don't have any interest in swapping my life out for theirs. And I guess I love my life and everything. I definitely feel like I'm working on the things I want to be working on, but even my friend who's would not want to swap his life out for theirs, right? So let's be really clear that like, I actually do believe in progress, and I think most people do who are participating in the world today in some sense. But when you pursue progress, there's two traps that you have to be careful about. And Steiner does a great job. And actually all these different religious, especially when you get into the Gnostic texts and you start getting into the substratum of Christian theology and poetry and Milton, you start to see that there's two obvious traps that can befall you in the pursuit of progress. And we seem to be succumbing to both of those today. And maybe you can delineate those concepts for people.
Yeah, 100%. So this leads really nicely into Steiner's presentation of the concepts of Lucifer, Ahriman, and Christ as this kind of trinity of forces that work through us and with each other. And it's kind of our place and this time now to mediate all these things working. So how Steiner sets up this cosmology is that we humans, we kind of like channel spirits through us, and that you have an ego, and your ego is kind of your individuality, and this in a sense gives you some say in how you balance what's channeled through you. What work do you do today, right? What do you choose with your time? So there's all these things vying to come through you, and you get some choice in what happens with that. So in Steiner's cosmology, Luciferian spirits is again like Promethean in a sense, but Lucifer is this idea to kind of spiritualize, and it is this generally like spiritualizing force. And Ahriman is the opposite force, which is to materialize. And this is really interesting because, again, in the school of humanity that Steiner proposes, the first thing to be incarnated as a human is you have to go out of spirit, this idea of possibilities, and you have to materialize into actuality. So you must take on a spirit that allows you to materialize. So Ahriman is the spiritual force of materialization, and in a sense, like death as well, recycling, that you have to take on in yourself in order to come down to earth to do this. So it's this really deep, necessary part of us. Now, Lucifer is this opposite kind of force where it's this desire, this spiritual force that wants us to spiritualize and leave material nature. And the Christ force is this idea of, well, we have to balance these two. And so the true, noble, or righteous and spiritual path is not to choose one or the other, as to like walk a balance between them. And this is really interesting because we have this presentation of Christianity, which has, in a sense, like distorted these concepts in a way that makes it really hard to parse. And generally, the concepts of Lucifer has become heaven, and the concept of Ahriman has become hell. And so if we imagine this kind of straw man of heaven, it's just this really loose, like cloudy place, feel good, not too many rules. And then hell is this really, really materialistic embodied, like animalistic, right? Just pleasure pain kind of environment, right? And so Steiner dictates this or builds this up as we have to overcome, Lucifer can be redeemed, and we have to overcome like the Ahrimanic impulse. So you got to take these ideas, these wild spiritual ideas, like the New Age, and all of the people that I really disliked upon listening to when trying to like sort all this stuff out. A lot of them are this character, this strawman archetype of kind of a New Age woo-woo hippie where you just like have a vision board or you manifest things, and there's not that much like rigor behind it. You just invoke a nebulous idea and kind of do what feels good. And this doesn't get people very far a lot of times, right? It's a trap. It's one of the traps that Shiloh is talking about. It's kind of this like empty spirituality where you're not actually doing any work on your stuff. You know, you like might order a ritual magic kit and perform. Again, it's externalizing something that you should be internalizing. Ahriman works a little bit differently. Ahriman is kind of this cold calculating force, most familiar in science, right? The Ahrimanic way of thinking is to separate everything and like really rigorously define it and put it in its bin. So where, you know, you have to tell me exactly what you mean by be magnetic to attract what you want, right? And in these definitions, we could really get lost in, just describing something that doesn't become reality. And so these two forces play with humanity in a very strange way that Steiner warns about, where our Luciferic desire to leave our body is why we want to escape death. We want to leave the problems that we're facing.
Leave the planet.
Leave the planet, exactly, right? Not become beholden to death, right? Harmonic recycler, right? We want to avoid this fate. So the way to leave the planet is your body is not built to do this, right? You can't jump up into space. So you weren't really built to do this by some seemingly divine order, but you can overcome it with Promethean technology, right? Put yourself in a rocket ship, in a spacesuit, and go off to Mars and build yourself an environment there, right? So you have this ability now, this new ability to even imagine beating this. Right. But then what is it that you sacrifice? What is it that you change about yourself in doing that? So things that will happen is you leave Earth's magnetic field. You'll leave like almost everything about the environment that you're suited to. When we send astronauts to space, they are extremely sick. right? So, in order to perform this feat of avoiding death, what you'll have to do is change yourself, potentially through technology, maybe by offloading some of your consciousness into a computer for something that you can compute, or in the case of like your health issues, again, replacing parts of your body or instituting systems that aren't natural to overcome these limitations. So inevitably, Steiner warns about this weird co-play between Lucifer and Ahriman, where Lucifer wants you to leave your body, and then Ahriman will kind of suck you down into this material computer chip or cyborg type being that is now so rooted in materialism that you can no longer actually, like, in a sense, resurrect as Jesus Christ did through his own inner mind, because you've destroyed that part of yourself. So he talks about these two forces working in this really, really strange way that leads directly to transhumanism.
And again, we're not like advocating Ludditism, right? There are aspects of each one of these elements which are super valuable, but nowhere is the question, what are we running from? Why are we trying to get away from the planet? Like, if we do get away from the planet, did we actually get away from what we were trying to get away from in the first place? Like, are there going to be homeless people on Mars too? Is this healthcare going to suck? Is it going to cost me $600 for a cream of some cream for my skin or something? Like, what's going on? What are we trying to escape here? And that doesn't enter into the actual scientific conception of addressing the problem in the first place. It misconceives the problem.
Well,
Yeah,
I think that we're trying to escape ourselves. Like, as you tell this story about the dualistic forces of immateriality and deep materialism, and the way that one will tempt you towards escapism, and the other one will trap you in this just dogged materialism, I'm struck by the fact that this is going to sound super out of left fields, but like, what if the project is to become something other than human?
It is, in a sense, but uh, it would be more so argued by the esoteric Christian that you're becoming like superhuman in the truest sense, where the idea is that true, like, masters and saints that have recorded this ability to do things like bilocate, levitate, uh, maybe visit, materialize, dematerialize. There's these stories that are deeply part of our history and recorded about these, in a sense, like miracles, and they're performed by the human body if we take these texts to be like truthful in their telling, right? And so the moral of the story that's putting forward is that you can do these superhuman things if you do the introspection and the work to unlock that part of yourself to figure out what it is that allows that to happen. But you can also cheat this with technology, right? And so there's this immediate choice then.
But there's the immediate thought that I have, which is that, there's a difference between a chimpanzee and a human. And yet, if you look at the
depends which human.
Who are you thinking of? You got somebody in mind?
Well, the problem is not like that we want to become different than the present version of ourselves. It's what's the attractor? Like, what are we aiming for? And
Well,
how do we
that's
represent that collectively enough to bind ourselves as a people into the next millennium?
Okay, so this is what I think I'm trying to get at, which is that perhaps there's some part of this project which is to become something other than human, because humans come with so much baggage. They come with so many animalistic impulses. Like, we are driven in huge part by evolutionary desires that don't necessarily fit onto the modern world. And so there's this one thread which says the modern world is too fragile to survive. It will collapse. It always has collapsed. Ergo, we have to maintain this humanness as it has always been for the last, 200,000 years of evolutionary history, because that is the thing that works. And yet, the planet is covered in different kinds of species. And there's no way that the human form is the final form of whatever lineage we are a part of. And so, inherent in any project about the future, I think there does have to be this question of well, are we trying to not become superhuman? Because that becomes loaded. That becomes
It becomes
hierarchical,
very loaded, right?
right? And
And also, hierarchy is actually a really interesting place. I'm sorry for cutting you off before your thought is done, but the what was kind of curious to me upon first of all encountering Steiner's cosmology when I first had it explained to me was very central to it is like you're in a school and there's hierarchies and these hierarchies are like grades, right? And so my immediate reaction is I don't like hierarchies, right? Shiloh, and we're just talking about how we're trying to throw off the scientific hierarchy that is keeping us down at some level. This conversation, right? We want the bloated over thing to become more amenable to how we want it to be done, right? So I was not a huge fan of hierarchies, but in central to this esoteric Christianity is this concept that there is a hierarchy of beings, and so we are human, and then above us there's angels, then archai, then archangels, and below us there's animal, plant, mineral, right? There's all these different hierarchies working with each other, and that's kind of the interesting thing of like working with each other is how it should be going. So Steiner uses this word spiritual economy, where as I kind of talk about the point of like Christ representing a balance between Luciferic and Ahrimanic pulses, the human job is not to choose one or the other, but to balance these two. Is that sorry, I've lost my train of thought here.
One thing I wanted to point out that's kind of fun is that in the Waldorf tradition, one of the things they always get popped for, by the way, Waldorf came out of Steiner directly, the Waldorf schools, but one of the things they always get popped for is teaching that all of the animals and plants descended from humans, not the other way around. So it's this kind of inverted evolutionary tract. And I don't know if that's what they literally mean, but that they're always getting dragged out into the street and beaten for that, the teaching that idea. Although they do seem to have better outcomes in the long, like the education seems to work. So
yeah, so that was very helpful for getting me on track. Thank you very much for talking about the hierarchies in this strange Steiner teaching. So I mentioned these hierarchies where it's like minerals, animals, plants, humans, angels. Okay, so in a sense, the goal here, the human project, is to evolve the human form and the human being and eventually become an angel, right? So there is like an out of this in this language, and it is to become an angel. And there is a way to do this, and there's a way to not do this, right? And so a way to not do this becomes like a fallen angel when you're kind of like cast out of the life wave. And the life wave is a term of art or organic evolution. These are both terms of art in this world that describes the natural evolution, where when you are following God's path, right, you follow the organic life wave. And then there's also the option now that we're becoming aware about is that you can choose not to. And this looks like a synthetic one where you start to make your own life wave. And these two look different, but the end result is both to like evolve the human form and structure in some way. So this is like deeply embedded in us in a certain way. Steiner says that the next evolution is to a place that he calls New Jupiter, or New Jerusalem is the biblical like way of doing this. And so in from the Wachowski siblings that made the Matrix, lots and lots of deep occult imagery buried there. They absolutely know what they're doing with that. A movie that we don't know as much about is one called Jupiter Ascending that came out afterwards, directly referencing this concept of a new Jupiter, which is the next human form that we should be like working to according to Steiner's cosmology. And so when you have a class of students and you want them to get there, right, you don't want to let like bad students through who aren't getting the lessons. So you have to have a place to shunt the things that aren't doing the human thing. So if you choose by your own volition and free will to not be human through transhumanism, then you get shunted to this other path. So when we're talking about, you mentioned this idea that's a strange Waldorf school teaching that plants and animals evolved from humans, this is a deep idea that is part of anthroposophy, which is Steiner's school of thought and how he named it. But it's also introduced to the West in by Helena Blavatsky from Theosophy with her work there. And so this is, she has this kind of quote that effectively is summed up as everything is at one time evolving to a human or has been evolving towards human at some point. So how this manifests in their cosmology is, well, we think of evolution as coming from like a bacteria, and then eventually building an organism, the original proto thing was the proto-human, and the bacteria and the plants and the animals are actually the evolutionary offshoots of everything that wasn't quite human enough, right? So in this,
I feel like we've like finally reached the crux of the biscuit, as they say. Like we're finally at this point where we're seeing that basically there's a huge divide in terms of the outlook for the future, which on one hand essentially views the human being as imperfectible and ultimate, and on the other hand recognizes that there is actually a lot of optimization possible for the species. However, the approach that's given to us by the modern institutional progressive scientism is that that's perfected through escapism, essentially. All of these technological escapisms. And the gods that they point to, maybe we can get into that in a minute. I really do want to talk about Ovulode before this moves on, but I think this is the hinge point, because I guess what I am absolutely convinced of is that both of those approaches miss the mark in totally different ways.
Pardon the interruption, but I have to ask you for a favor. If you like this podcast, if you've watched a couple of episodes and you're like, man, what a cool show that these people are running, then come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and sign up to support the podcast for as little as 75 cents a week. In general, I think most people, not everybody, but a lot of people can afford 75 cents a week, and through the power of large numbers, you can help ensure that this podcast never gets sponsorships, it never has advertisements, we never have to sell you anything, and we never have to be beholden to any community except our community of listeners that wants us to keep searching for the ideas that are going to change the world. So come over to patreon.com/DemystifySci and join the community today. I'll see you there. I spend a fair amount of time with my finger in the cultural waters, so to speak, because I read a lot of stuff on Twitter. And yes, a lot of it is junky or whatever, but I do feel like it represents the sides of the culture war pretty well. And everything that I've seen seems to organize people along the axis of this like return to the land, trad social organization, the rebirth of old religions, versus the axis that seeks to transcend our human bodies, to embrace the technological improvements that are possible through science and engineering and genetic modification, to get to the point where we're a multiplanetary species, like all of these things. And it seems like these two groups really do represent vectors of human evolution that are pointing in opposite directions. Because I think that in the ideal world, there's not like a true conflict that emerges from them. It's just a live or let live situation, the same way that, like, I come back to this all of the time. I'm like, if the theory of evolution is correct, that one species can change into a different form, then that means that from that unified ancestor, from the common ancestor, you have some kind of cultural, social shift that produces the new species that come out of that. And it's not that maybe in some cases, the way that the animals deal with this is by eradicating the parallel species that emerges with them. But I think that in an ideal world where we embody our most honorable human traits, what happens is that you just have these two lineages that manage to proceed in parallel and just end up in radically different places. And so I think that what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the sort of the characters that embody each end of this axis. And then Shiloh wants to make
That
the
sounds
point.
good. Let's do that. Let's look at the default trajectories of either one of. I mean, it's obviously a fragmentary future, which isn't good to begin with. Just on its face, you have two orthogonal trajectories: one planet, one human being.
Well, I think that's the
That's gonna be a
thing, is
problem.
that, is it really one human being? This is what I was trying to say earlier. I'm like, I think that there is the identity of human that one can hold on to that is historical. And then there is the identity of what comes next that you embrace, which is inevitably alienating to those that wish to remain as they always were. But I think that that's kind of inevitable. Like, nothing stays the same. Everything must change.
I mean, you got to be careful for your own biases though, because like you're already assuming a Darwinian motif, and one side of this argument assumes a Darwinian motif, and the other does not, as it applies to humans.
But both do assume evolution when we're talking about esoteric Christianity and not dogmatic, right? In the church, in the core essence of a lot of these like esoteric versions of this religion, and I say esoteric versions of this religion because what this purports to be is like the true story that's relatively undiluted by the institutions that come along and co-opt it, but that Darwin poses that humans are evolving and can evolve, and esoteric Christianity also poses that we're evolving, right? Esoteric Christianity explicitly puts us as evolving towards a form of human that exists on New Jupiter, right? I don't like know what that means or even like care.
I think esoteric Christianity is like it's a pointer towards our discussion of the future. But when we talk about the two sides, like we are talking about one side, which is regressively pointing to the reestablishment of institutional religions, and the other side that's pointing to the abandonment of the former human being body and everything. And those, I just want to make sure we don't get confused, because like those are the two poles of this that are shooting off right now.
And I think that esoteric Christianity, by your description of it, would fall more towards the transhumanist end of things. The strategies that they would employ to get there would be very different.
Right,
but the spirit...
We have to be different than we are now. So in a sense, we're going to a new humanity. So you're totally right with that, right? And so then how do we get there, right? So not employing technology in the same way as the transhumanists, and in an odd way borrowing from nature as, right, the people who might be as like a bioreaction or bioconservative person who wants to go back, right? So the idea of again, this evolution of humanity through these like esoteric religions is that how, and Anastasia, earlier you talked about these cycles of cycles, but sometimes the cycles stack up to get a little bit different, right? So this newness, you're supposed, humanity's evolution will always be confronted with slightly new cycles, or it's the same kind of cycle with a new twist. And so with this twist, you have to incorporate something new and leave something else behind, right? And this is kind of just the normal human being growing up as well, right? Like the young me learned something new and that worked on me and changed me, so I believe something different, so I kind of leave the old me behind. I'm still the same person, but I don't really view the world through my old eyes as much anymore because of what I came across. And in the same way, this is kind of how the mechanism of evolution employed by the Steiner school works when they're talking about plants and animals evolving from humans. In a sense, this was something that adopted some traits of humans, but wasn't quite perfect. So it was precipitated out, right? It was dropped out of what the human evolution is doing. And in this is thermodynamically similar to science with crystallization. Crystallization is a way of purifying a component out of a solution, right? So I can recrystallize the sugar out of my sugar water. And in a sense, the leftover, like I can get rid of it and keep the pure essence. So when these religions are talking about developing your immortal body or your diamond body or your resurrection body, in a sense, this resurrection body, this immortalizing yourself in your head, kind of as is implied by Christ at the mystery of Golgotha, is to shed all of these other parts of you that you don't want to bring with you to your next evolution, right? And so that stays somewhere in this world. And so in a sense, those shed parts become the world around us, the plants, the trees, everything that didn't quite make it to human in this cosmology. And so with this, there's always, you take something new, a new lesson, and you have to unlearn something that no longer works. And again, what we're getting around is this idea of individuality. This idea of individuality is really changed for human evolution, where the Western school of thought really puts forward the individual as this really important character. And this is kind of a newer thing that we see. And so how do we have this unified human organism moving through, but the same way it has to branch off into individual parts, and then at some point it has to come back? And this is the New Jerusalem part. This is kind of what Steiner's talking about, is that in this life wave, it does lead back to a unification of humanity. We have to unify all these individuals again. And so there's a few ways that this can happen, right? One that accepts and incorporates all of our individuality, our preferences, our contributions, and there's another one that tries to just make us all the same. Right, that's another way of doing the
Oh,
exact
the
same thing.
replicators versus the
Yes,
team consciousness. Yes, Andres
exactly.
calls them.
Right. And so I think that when we're talking about these like bioreactionary and transhuman, there's something from both camps that we're supposed to keep with us, and then there's something from both camps we're supposed to shed according to this cosmology, and that's walking this middle path, which would be called like the Christ force, or again trying to balance the Luciferic and Ahrimanic forces. And I think that's kind of like what's up against us now is that uh, right, we see this bioreactionary force, and I don't want to give up all the technology as a scientist. It's just not what I'm doing. Right, I love my technology. I love like I joke that my computer's like my horse. Right, like I'm a cowboy in the West, and I like have this special bond with this creature because it's got all of my crystallography programs. It's got all of my career on it. We like wrestle with each other. Its RAM dies occasionally. I have to replace it, and it's heartbreaking. All these things, right? But at the same time, um, I want to bring this with me, but I don't want to be beholden to it. And so this is like an interesting thing where what's kind of showing up with this transhuman and this technology thing of especially AI. AI is so central to this story. Is that we start to outsource our judgment to the machine, right? And this is kind of an interesting thing because it is kind of giving up a bit of your humanity or a bit of your ability to interact with this world, and it's giving it up to another entity, right? And this is kind of interesting because this is a sense of betrayal, or rather not using what you should be doing, which is developing your inner self of decision making. And so when we put that out there, what is then driving us?
I mean, it's
Maybe
so
that's
interesting because I'm like, I have a hard time differentiating the impact of various technologies on the human mind. It's hard for me to think back on the moment that fire appeared as a tool that humans could use and think of that moment as not containing this same sort of tension within it. Because you would live fine without fire before somebody learns to control it, and you're perfectly happy, and your world is good, and it's organized in a specific way. And then all of the sudden, there's a fracture point where you have this new technology, and on the other side of it, you don't want to give it up, and yet you are fully molded by it. And I'm like, is it even possible to think about a technology as simple as fire, perhaps the first technology? Let's maybe not. One could argue that, but let's say that it is. Is it even reasonable or legible to think about evolving in a way that you're not controlled by it?
controlled by it is really interesting because you never want to be controlled by it because in a sense, according to like what Steiner would argue is that humans are kind of trying to exercise some control over here. So if someone else is driving, you're not doing your job. But then by the same token, Steiner wants you to be evolving on this like one particular path, right? Of to this like evolutionary life ways. So it kind of does restrict your degrees of freedom. So this is like a really interesting tension or balance.
Well, I'm like,
But
by the time that you grow used to eating cooked food, let's say it's a few your parents grew up eating just raw. Fire is invented, and a couple generations later, you have people that have never eaten certain foods raw.
can't go back.
You can't go back. That's what I'm trying to say. Like, is that not being controlled by the simplest possible technology already? Where you must maintain the technology, you must have it be central. You have a hearth. The way that your day is structured has changed. It's unimaginable to go
I
back to
think
the way
Right.
that
that's
it
totally
was.
fine, but the problem is when you sort of project that into the future, like our whole existence is going to revolve around fire, and fire is going to give us all the answers to everything. These AI singularity people are predicting a rapture, essentially, right?
Okay, so in the most esoteric way possible, it does seem like you could build a model of the world where fire does give you the answers to everything. Because if you take fire as the primordial substance of just combusting wood, that's absurd. But if you take fire and you trace it through the entire process of technological development all the way to the machines that have batteries inside of them, where the fire has been transmuted into something that is not combustion, but is now like lithium-ion battery technology. Like, that does seem like our goal has been from the beginning to produce something that can give us answers that is born of the natural world. And as we say, like, okay, and I don't know that I necessarily believe in this. I'm just presenting this, like, picture of the world that I can imagine. I'm like, if you have intelligent machines that are self-reproducing, that grow and live in parallel to humans, where it's not a system that you have to maintain, but it's a system that maintains itself, then maybe that's the arc that we've been on since the very first moment that we produced technology. Like, not explicitly.
I'm surprised you're seduced by that. Like,
I'm not seduced by it. I can just see it as a possibility.
but there's no, like, these machines aren't intelligent,
Not
and
yet.
they aren't self-replicating, and they
Not
don't
yet.
have life breathed into them at all.
Not yet.
Right.
But
That's always the
AI
thing, is
is
it's always like a matter of time, right? That's the prophecy. That's the singularity. That's the machine rapture. We're like, yeah, but they're going to be alive. Like, they're definitely going to be alive soon. And like, that's on the left side of this teeter-totter. That's the promise of the prophecy.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you take the first technological step that humans ever took that separated them from the common ancestor, that doesn't have fire, that doesn't have any technology, then compare it to the technology that we have built along that lineage, it does seem like we are aiming. It's impossible for me to see it not as being a project that aims for something. And you're like, that goal is unachievable. And I'm like, maybe. But it also seems plausible that if we have a theory of consciousness that has to do with embodiment and learning and self-reproduction and all of these things that we associate with life, it doesn't seem impossible to me to have a system that is not exactly like life, but close enough to be a being that requires moral consideration and is capable of existing alongside humans in a way that it becomes inexorable and a complete restructuring of the way that we live the world, the exact same way that fire was at the very beginning.
I think that we really run the risk of, again, I think, can I put a different spin on this, which is kind of Chainsian in scope? Right. So Julian James, bicameral mind, he had this take on the evolution of humanity, where we had these voices in our heads, and we always thought they were the gods talking to us. And then one day somebody was like, oh, dang, I think that's actually me having thoughts in my head. And humanity kind of evolves, and he tries to place this on the timeline happening around the time of the Homeric epics and so forth. And I feel like this is really important, and it's playing out in this discussion right now, because we're talking about externalizing that locus of guidance outside of ourselves with these machine gods in this case. It's like the answers will come from somewhere else, some entity which we construct that will have all the answers for us will be outside of us. Whereas like the true path towards a future that's actually in line with what we want to be as human beings comes directed from our internal sense of what we can be. I just feel like the offshoring of that outside of the human being, in either case, whether you offshore it to an institution on one side of the teeter-totter, these old world religions, whatever, or you offshore it to the machine gods, in either case, you're externalizing something that should be internally cultivated instead.
Yes, I see what you're saying. And I think that the counterpoint that I can offer to that is that the tool is inanimate until you reach into it, right? Like, this is something that we always talk about. It's not like the machine comes and asks you questions. It's not like first thing when you wake up in the morning, it says, "Hey, Michael, how's your day going? You know, I spent all night thinking about this
Yeah.
thing that you've never asked me about. What do you think about it?" Like,
Yeah.
it doesn't do that. And
But it seduces you, like it can. I mean, I see this all the time in like the music world where people get seduced by gear, especially as I've gotten into modular synthesis, where people are like, man, I just need to get this one more module and then like my music's going to write itself or something. Like people really, they don't say that, but they act as if they believe that.
No, but the same, again, returning to the super simple example of the fire. The fire is not going to do anything for you unless you harness it. Like fire by its very nature is destructive.
And so who's that you? Like that's what needs the guidance is the you.
And what I think that in a really primordial sense, you can think of fire as also having its own intelligence that tells you how to do things. Once you realize that, I know that sounds crazy, but hear me out. If you harness fire and you know that you can use it to cook things, there's probably going to be a point where you burn down your village. Right? Like that's going to happen at some point, probably relatively
that almost
soon.
happened about a month ago here.
Yeah, exactly. Well, he was trying to hide a body, so that's different. But you look into the fire, and the fire is telling you something about the world, which is, oh, if we build our houses from combustible materials, then we always run the risk of them burning down. Perhaps we should build from stone instead. And obviously it's not so linear, because as long as you have wood, maybe what you do is you learn to be much more careful about fire. But the idea that the technology that you have discovered is not something that you then use to divine information about the world seems to me to be kind of a limited view of technology. Like any technology that you invent, that you interact with, is going to, at the interface between you and it and the world, tell you about how you should do things.
So you can not about how you should do things. It opens up the possibility that you might be able to see things better and then be able to orient yourself towards the solution better. But like the Mayan priests, like they were pretty good at predicting patterns, but they just had the completely backwards idea about how to go about meeting those challenges that they could predict.
Right. And so you can imagine a situation. Okay, so let's imagine that they had an LLM. They had like some kind of AI, the Mayans. And they could be like, look, we found all of these patterns. Okay, well, this example falls apart immediately, because you have to train it on the existing knowledge of the universe, and the existing knowledge of the universe would be like, you should definitely.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
So there's like a lot going on here, but
that's a really good example. Yeah, well, I love that. Yeah, if they would have had an LLM, it would have absolutely been like, you got to cut more hearts out for sure.
It's doing the same thing they were doing, but more, right? And so this is again this like issue with how do we get off this ride, right? This dances around an interesting like concept that is actually like very central and very strange to the whole esoteric story coming out into the West, and then Steiner's personal story as well. And it's something called, I'll start off with it, called the Eighth Sphere. And what this is saying is that there's, in Steiner's cosmology, and almost every single deep, like at the heart of many religions, is like 7 stages of evolution. So I'm going to call them like 7 grades, like we're at Hogwarts. But so the humans start off as an idea, disembody just the potential. They have to materialize and embody, and then the humans have to dematerialize and disembody out. And this goes through all 7 stages, right? And so Steiner has this as Saturn, Sun, Moon, Earth, Jupiter, Venus, and then Vulcan. So right now we're in Earth, so we're at 4 of 7, right? But then there's this concept called the Eighth Sphere, and the Eighth Sphere was first mentioned by an author who I forget the name of, I think in the 1800s, but he attributed it to the moon. And then Steiner came back and thought that this was a grave error, that it doesn't have to do with the moon necessarily. What the Eighth Sphere really represents is a sphere for human creation that cannot go along the life wave. So what is the sphere of human creation that like can't reincarnate and move along the life wave? And an interesting like consequence of this is, in a sense, our art is, right? So art is kind of like channel this spiritual idea into the flesh of the world, right? Like there's this rock, it's marble, strange thing about marble actually made by the bones of animals, right? Into limestone that's been then metamorphosed into. And so Steiner says that there's an interesting relationship between animals and the mineral world. And I'm pointing out that one of them is that we kind of like build the minerals around us in some sense. But the artist sculpts this marble. And so before the marble itself, its spiritual impulse is not to be to do anything necessarily. But humans come along and they make this object. And this is Promethean, right? You're taking something and you're kind of putting your technology and you're making something different. We do the same thing by putting fire into silicone, right? We take this thing, we exercise our art, and we make this thing. And then, as Anastasia also alluded to, like, we can build this AI with this silicone, and we can feed all of this about our history into it and have us help predict the future. But it will only ever be us in the material world. It kind of cuts out the spiritual concept. And so a long time ago on this podcast, I talked about the difference between random number generators, that random numbers rely on the outside world to come about. And computer random number generators are not actually, if they don't sample the outside world, it's just a mathematical algorithm that you're sampling. So again, it's this human creation. And so in a sense, all this human creation is the eighth sphere that Steiner is talking about. And this doesn't travel with us, right? So if you are to then disembody yourself and offload all of your humanity onto this computer chip, this AI, he, in a sense, is saying that you're putting yourself into this eighth sphere and that this isn't really along the organic life wave. And so this apparently, according to Steiner, was this big mystical secret that the mystery schools did not want to share with humanity, because it evidences that when they tried to prophesize the future, looked ahead, that they saw this huge industrial takeover in this fake world that humans would build that they trapped themselves in. And they called it the eighth sphere, and that it was dangerous to let this out. But that's this history that's kind of nebulous, and it's hard for us to like believe everything about it. But I think the concept still stands, is that he had this bin for human creation, and that if we're not careful about offloading our decision making and humanity into this eighth sphere, that we will just become trapped in it, right? This kind of like offshoot. And again, it's like when Waldorf schools say that everything evolved from human, right? The eighth sphere is where all the non-human stuff went, while humans went to New Jupiter or Venus or Vulcan, the next steps, right? And so that's the warning that he explicitly talks about with technology, and is kind of this interesting intrigue with the mystery schools and history. And that's kind of what I wanted to cover with the idea of this human creation. So earlier, when I was talking about random numbers only being sampled from nature and computers being unable to come up with truly random numbers, it does kind of evidence to this, where when you put the Mayan information into the LLM and have it predict the future, it's going to tell you a Mayan future, right? When you put the mathematical formula to give you a random number into the computer, it's going to give you that mathematical formula, right? It's always a reflection of just us, but without the spirit. And so that spirit kind of is this randomness of the universe, that thing that gets in the cycle that makes it a little bit different, that as you start to control that randomness, you inevitably start to seemingly edge out, in Steiner's sense, like God's will, right? You gain control over that. And so you start to harness, you take away from this randomness, anything could happen, and you start to really try and control what the outcomes can be with your technology and with your information systems. But the trick is that will always be like a reflection of you that you build with that, right? That marble is always, that you sculpt is always a reflection of you. The silicon chip that you build and program is always a reflection of you. Yeah. And so in a sense, for the internal spiritual development, it kind of is inviting us to look outward as well to the community, because that's where the new information is coming from, to harmonize as well. That was maybe like a lot in a strange journey, but it's kind of led into this idea of the eighth sphere.
No, I think that it makes a lot of sense. Basically, let me check to make sure that I understand. The idea is that if you take the technology to be some kind of if you take technology itself to be the thing that you are aiming for, what's going to end up happening is that you end up creating a hall of mirrors, where the only thing that's reflected inside of that hall of mirrors is some prior form of you, not the future form of you. And so it abrogates any ability to develop into the future, because you're like, well, hold on a second. This is the sphere of information and ideas that we have for what it means to do things correctly, and nothing exists outside of that.
Like every time I use an AI, I have to kind of remind it who I am and what my values are. Like if I'm like,
You're supposed
hey,
to put that in the system prompt, just so you know.
what's that?
There's a system prompt you have to
I can just tell it that. Okay, well, you can teach me how to do that later. That would be really helpful. But yeah, everything I'm doing when I'm like, I need it to like help me organize some thoughts about something. I have to kind of always reorient it towards what I want to project. Like I have to teach it that.
And it's also really fallible. Like earlier, I mentioned this idea of transubstantiation and the Eucharist as the body of Christ being this like really vital piece of religious faith. And I was trying to figure out where it came from. And so I was asking Chat, and I was like, do you know where this idea comes from? And it just listed all these authors that had nothing to do with it. And then I went and I looked through the books that I have on my phone, and I found that it's actually Bernard Pullman's like The Atom and the History of Human Thought. And so I just remembered this passage from the book. And so I found it immediately by just looking for Eucharist when I opened the book. But the model itself doesn't actually have enough indexing power to even look through the extant books of the universe. Like it's not able to say, oh, this idea is here. It can only like re-reference the body of knowledge where if somebody else has referenced Pullman's book in many, many different places specifically about this discussion, then it's treaded enough, it's created enough of a groove in human thought that it can actually pull it, but it's like deeply limited.
Right.
And so
there's like an interesting little future thing that is going to happen very, very soon, undoubtedly. And I don't think anyone will like really disagree with this, which is surprising but curious, is that we have some ancient scrolls and texts that we can't translate, right? That we don't have, we don't seem to have to. But what we can do is we can feed an LLM as much of anything we want it and ask it to translate that text for us. And it's going to give us a translation. But what will that translation tell us? Right. And I think that this is saying that like we didn't know going in, and we don't know how to judge the outcome of that ourselves either, because we don't really like have a deep, we'll again fall into this thing of this big reflection of ourselves. So there will be like the Voynich manuscripts is an example of a text that we don't seem to be able to translate. And so what is our judgment for the outcome of this when we do apply our LLM? Because we know that it'll just be this amalgamation of what we fed the machine learning algorithm to give us in the first place. And I think that this will have a few curious like outcomes. Was some people will like believe that LLMs are really good, but as we've kind of been dancing around some today, like there's the transhuman idea of kind of uploading yourself or putting yourself into a ship and going to Mars is the same kind of concept as resurrection, right? Of being immortal, of escaping fate, of escaping death, right? It strikes the same thing, but they're manifested in two totally different ways, completely different from each other. So when we have this LLM give us an answer, right, it's probably going to be an answer, but it might lose some of the like the human elements that would tell us a bit more about how this would happen.
it's so interesting. Okay, so let's see if we can tie.
It also just has no ability to self-orient towards the solutions that we want. And I guess for me, I'm looking at the history of the world and I'm like, the concept of God has historically been the stand-in for that. So I think it has served us really well in many ways to have this concept of God. Like when you walk into a courtroom, there's a big thing over the judge that says, "In God we trust." And you might naively be like, well, that's stupid and superstitious. But it's like, hold on a second. It's actually probably a really good idea that there's somebody above the judge, at least this conceptual, symbolic representation of some higher version of that summarizes the collective aim of the society towards some best version of ourselves, right? And obviously, like, this has been, people have tried to revitalize Christianity, like people like Jordan Peterson have tried to focus in on the symbolic substructure behind the concept of God. And I think that that's very noble, but I also feel like the brand of God itself is so incompatible with our rational scientific sense of who we are as people that can understand material nature, that the brand is kind of doomed in that sense. And so that that gets me kind of oriented towards what is the future representation of that. And on one hand, it's this regressive, well, we already nailed it with Christianity or something, let's just stick with that. On the other hand, it's Avi Loeb being like, well, the singularity people being like, well, the machine gods or the UFO gods are going to come and teach us all of the things we need to know, right? And
we're like, somebody somewhere must have the answers.
But they're both externalized, right? And I'm like, no, we need to actually create a shared symbolic substructure. This is so heretical, but that replaces the outdated concept of God. And I feel really bad saying that, because I understand that the concept of God has been really useful. But the fact of the matter is, and Nietzsche predicted this 100 years ago, like, that it's a doomed concept. Like, people aren't buying into it like they used to at the spear tip of civilization in the West. And so what's the next evolution of that attractor, that axis by which we spiral around as we move forward in terms of affecting our best possible version of ourselves?
Okay, so it's really hard to avoid the idea that maybe it's aliens, right? Because you read abduction narratives. I know! But no, check it out. You read... Go ahead.
No, it makes perfect sense, right? You're going to say...
Well, no, you read abduction narratives, and everybody comes away from the abduction experience with this sense that the aliens have told them how to be, and the way that the aliens have told them how to be is they have to be good stewards of the planet, and they have to take care of each other, and they have to do good in the world, and that they're responsible for the saving of humanity. Like, people come back with a savior complex from these experiences. And you can point to that being some kind of psychological predisposition to enormous metaphysical events that lends them to this sort of grandiose fantasy about the fact that they are the savior of the world. Or you can imagine that the idea of extraterrestrials is such a powerful orienting symbol that all of a sudden it gives us something to aim for, because on a closed planet where humans are the apex predators that are in possession of technology that is indistinguishable from magic, we have embodied the mythological form of God already. Like, we can do anything. Like, we can embryo select, we can breed crops, we can change the weather. Like, we can do anything we want. And so the only thing now that's left is some kind of structure that's outside of us to tell us what we should do. And I'm sorry, I think it's aliens, man.
Oh my God.
It's
all right.
Clear.
Oh my God. Can we talk about, what's the name of that Avi Loeb article? It's just nails this on the head, just so people don't think that we are...
the fact that he thinks that it's a messianic object? Hold on, let me see if I can
we
find
should
it.
read a little bit. Yeah, we should say that headline and see.
This is absolutely the thesis of the techno-utopians.
So this is actually a long time ago, from 2023. Is that the one that you were thinking of?
I think that there's a few articles, so it probably is. Yeah, they should all say similar things.
Yeah, so in his Wikipedia article, Encyclopedia of Lies, I know, but in 2024, Loeb delivered a speech in which he declared his view that the Messiah will be an alien that arrives from outer space. And if you go to his Medium page, there's an article from 2023 which is called "An Extraterrestrial Messiah?" ? And go ahead.
What this builds towards is this is exactly kind of again, looking for the new Messiah. And so inherent to a lot of prophecy from these religions. So first of all, as we kind of discussed, our history has been one of having some Messiah, some prophecy that gives us this meaning and tells us the should, as like Shiloh put. So now the world is at this point where it's primed for a new religion. And kind of just like in the pagan times when people were fed up with sacrifice and then Christianity comes along and people are willing to adopt this. Now we're here deep into Christianity, and people are not happy with this church that covers up for sexual abuse. That is this clearly like overwhelming bureaucratic force that people are feeling alienated from, then it's again perfectly right for this topple, right? And what is put in this place to move us along for this next thing? So there's some strange things that are happening around the world to think that it might be aliens. Is this, first of all, we're here talking about it. That's curious. People are thinking about it, and we're not alone. So who's talking about this? Strangely, so far, the Mormon Church has always been amenable to extraterrestrials and like living on a planet. The church recently changed its doctrine so that if there was alien life, it would be considered divine and not needing a baptism. I think that this is a recent doctrine change. And I'm trying to think of so various governments around the world are all starting to acknowledge UFOs now in an official capacity, right? So this is definitely like coming up and it's a topic for a time. And large organizations are making moves. So strangely, the religious organizations were the ones to start to address space for aliens within their religion far before science. Nation of Islam is also an interesting one, that where alien interaction is inherently built in. Scientology, another new religion that's being started that is deeply tied to this, and all of them have these messiah characters. And so deep within.
Well, no, it's just so interesting because like Shiloh and I've been talking about this the last few days, where it's like by the time that Christianity becomes the state religion, it's not like there's a linear path where there's a single narrative that's born for 300 or 400 years, uninterrupted, and then arrives in this perfect form to become state doctrine. There's many, many different sects with different interpretations of the way that these mythological pieces fit together, the way that the story should be told. Like Shiloh's always talking about the fact that there's like a sect for whom Jesus had a consort named, what was it, Sophia?
Sophia, yeah. So a lot of these Gnostic experiments in Christianity that were largely suppressed by the Roman Empire, along with just the more blasé Christian ideas, they were very, very different. So I guess what I would expect to see in our modern age in this similar kind of imperial transition where there's this gaping void of people not really identifying with the old religions, that happened in Rome too, in these 4 centuries. But there was a lot of experimentation, right? And I don't see a lot of that.
But that's exactly what Michael was just talking about.
That's my whole point, is that the world is showing that this experimentation is happening. People are putting these ideas all out there. And so we have these like stories that are deeply old. And I'm talking about Steiner's cosmology as an evidence of a story that's really old. And then we have all these stories that are not paying attention in the same ways, right? Like, first of all, Avi Loeb is directly borrowing from religion to claim a messiah for this, and CERN is directly borrowing from religion to put Shiva in their like campus, right? So
to be fair, the Shiva statue was a gift from India.
That's totally reasonable, right? Just like
it would be much funnier and stranger. Yeah, exactly.
Right. They get a few authors on each paper though every time they come out. That's the trade.
I think it's worth it. If I could get off the ship like that, I'll make metal sculpture. What I think Anastasia is right, that like there are power plays being made in the world, whether we believe it as genuine or premeditated or just off the cuff. No matter how you interpret it, in some way we can take this as players are making this power or this pivot. And so a classic disinformation thing that again, a lot of the research and stuff I've looked into is strangely about the CIA, because the CIA is at Scientology ties to CIA people when it started, right? L. Ron Hubbard, like Jack Parsons, like all these have some ties.
Did you make a note to bleep that word out?
Yeah, we can't say that word on this podcast.
I'm very sorry.
It's all good. I'll burp it out.
So it says that we're only at an hour, but that's an hour.
I got it.
If you mark down clock time, it'll work out. I'm sorry. Continue.
I didn't realize the game that we were playing, but yeah. There is how disinformation works is you can't, or not how a modern, right? So if you want disinformation to build towards something, you kind of have to like sell a story and get people to buy it. That's really hard, but it's easy to just put out many stories and see what naturally takes off. And so TikTok, Instagram, all of this is like right for this. So you can just flood with many stories and kind of let humanity just patch itself together normally.
Well, and the stories predate the technological age. This isn't a new idea. Like, there's
Right.
observations as early as the 1500s of strange things in the sky and crosses and all of these like weird objects. I think that it was in Nuremberg. There was some kind of
Nuremberg
like
is a space battle,
strange.
1561. I mean, space battle. There is recorded strangeness in the sky above Nuremberg in a very dramatic fashion, right? That's definitely a big, but throughout history, right, there's like flaming shields that may have been interacting with people and boats or the Roman legions marching around. And so we would have stories for this. And traditionally, these stories were placing angels in a lot of these parts. There's also some biblical stories. There's like Ezekiel and Enoch. There's these different books.
The angels made a big appearance in the Gnostic traditions too, from what I understand. In fact, they kind of treated, in some sects, they treated Christ as synonymous with this archangel entity, sort of like Michael in the Catholic tradition, something like that.
Well, it's like it makes perfect sense that you have to have a structure for something to evolve towards, because whether or not that structure is something that you have created de novo simply because somebody is a really talented, imaginative writer that manages to put it in a sufficiently tasty, mimetic way that it catches on, or it's a sighting or it's a hallucination that somebody has, or it's an abduction experience. All of these things are providing the ground for an act that I think is inherent to humans, which is that we want to move towards something. There's so much ink that has been spilled over the question of what does it mean, the fact that the frontier has disappeared? What effect has it had on human psychology, that there's no place on the planet where you can go to be out of reach of some overbearing state or society or anything else? You know, there's no escape from the enclosed condition of the world. And so it makes perfect sense that the mythology of the future is the mythology that reopens that horizon and says, no, we are not limited to this earthly plane. There is the entire galaxy to explore. There's the entire universe to be a part of and to reform ourselves inside of.
Right. And so oddly, science is that lens, that tool to open us up to this idea of the galaxy, right, being around. So this idea of aliens being this concept of, this being that's very powerful, very messianic, very strange, right? It's relatively new. It's like from the 1900s. So there's an interesting, a lot of what I talk about and share with you is actually for information I first got from Gigi Young, and she has a literal, a video that is literally titled "Angels to Aliens," where she talks about the transition where what we used to talk about and call in the terms of angels, because of the language was that of religion, and we had this frame to interpret it by. Around 100 years ago, we start to turn that into aliens. And this actually ties into some Nazi esotericism and ideology, where there's some German organizations like the Vril Society, and some of these are like questionable providence, right? That's pretty sparse so how do we know these things existed? Some of these names are written on some like propaganda brochures that people have saved from the 1900s. Right? So there's some scant evidence, there's some other stuff, but the idea is that in Nazi ideology, there's a group of aliens that destroyed their own planet, and that planet has a name. It might be Marduk, some other ones. There's some other names through the ages. And this is the asteroid belt, right? This is represented by the asteroid belt in our solar system in some ways. And so then they came to Earth and, in a sense, interacted with us. And so we're supposed to grow up and try and not destroy our planet. And they introduced this concept of aliens in the early 1900s. And this becomes part of Nazi esoterica, and actually also evolves into, effectively, this is what Eric von Daniken is saying in Chariots of the Gods, which is what Ancient Aliens is based off of. So if we trace back the history of these ideas, and again, when I'm talking about Steiner is tracing back the history of these esoteric Christian ideas back through time. Gigi Young and her Angels to Aliens is tracing back these ideas and sources through time, right? I'm trying to talk about literature and referencing our past, also while like trying to draw these interesting themes from it. But Uh,
Can I just
So
put my finger on why I think the aliens thing is scary? Maybe
Why is
I'm
that?
just intuitively like I'm just cringing to death over here about you guys. Because maybe I think you're right. Is what about the fact that that is kind of in some sense something that people on both sides of the teeter-totter are oriented towards. It's
Like, I don't necessarily think that it's good. I'm not giving it this like a rousing endorsement of like aliens are awesome. I'm
One-
just like, I think that I see it as being the natural emergence.
right, right, and I think I just
You hate that?
something about what you're saying. I do, but the reason that I hate it is I think grounded in some historical precedent, which takes us back to the Mesoamericans once again.
Mm.
Because the Mesoamericans also believed that aliens were going to show up one day. And what happened was the aliens showed up and they preyed on the belief that the Mesoamericans, the Aztec people at that point in time were the superpower in the region.
These aliens look like me.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
they were like, oh, these are the freaking Messiah aliens. Like, everything is going to be all good from now on.
Right. Could be a Spanish conquistador. Could be an alien god. Like, how do you know?
Well, I mean, we can reason our way from first principles that there probably is not a technologically advanced civilization living beyond some kind of, veil of space-time that shares the planet with us, where, I'll say this. If there is such an entity that inhabits the Earth with us that one day steps out from behind the veil and looks just like us but is far more technologically advanced, I'm like, okay, those are aliens.
Well,
What are
they
you going
didn't
to do
look
about
like
it?
that. They didn't look like the indigenous natives at all.
They had two eyes. They had a nose.
I think they were crazy looking
I'm
compared
sure that
to
they
what
were.
people were used to. I think they were basically graylings. Like, they were totally different looking. And I'm like, are we opening ourselves up to put these entities on high as if they're going to be messiahs, but in reality they're just predatory beings, like apex predators like we are, and they just end up colonizing us because we open the door to them because we're like, oh, they're so cute and like they have all the answers and they're going to tell us how we should live and how to do everything better.
I think the reaction is going to span the entire gamut. Like, I think that there's going to be plenty of. I imagine that no state power would want to give over any of its influence or control to an alien entity that shows up. So I imagine that that's going to be like a war of the worlds type of situation. And there's going to be a lot of messianic cults that are like, no, these people are here, these creatures are here to save the world. Like, I don't think that there's going to be some unified response if a spaceship lands on the White House lawn. Like, it's going to completely fracture society according to what you think that we should do.
Like 1,000,000,000% that there's many stories going around. Everyone, like, if something happens, everyone will have their own interpretation. But what's curious is that if we're being fed stories about aliens, I'm posing that these stories about aliens are relatively new in human history, like from the 1900s. They coincide with science starting to take over this role of prophecy and where the truth comes from. So as opposed to a state actor having a religious person next to them, they have a scientist to get that emphasis of what they say is truth. And so now we have ancient aliens trying to scientifize this story of alien beings possibly coming and interacting with humanity in the past. We have a high-level scientist, Avi Loeb, invoking this concept in his research and then trying to build these stories to where this alien would be this messiah, where we have so many problems on Earth, we can't trust ourselves to solve this. Let's have these aliens control the nuclear codes, that kind of thing. And again, all of this is evidence of externalization, of having responsibility upon ourselves, right? This is all taking what we should be doing ourselves, which is learning how to coexist, and then hoping that the Messiah aliens come up and sort us straight, right? So this is very much not in line with the wave. And you can kind of see this where are the stories of alien abductions, right? They're stories of barging into your home and effectively rape, right? Like horrible, horrible overtreading of human boundaries. Right. So in a sense, these creatures are telling you that what they believe about the future, right? If they are, as Anastasia said, imparting these stories about worry about destroying the future, like how they're treating one is not very empathetic, right? And so this shouldn't be like forgotten. All of these tech people who are ushering in alien or AI as this messiah, have we already solved the structural issues with each other to where this will actually free up our workday? Like, will the tractor actually let us do 2 hours of work a day? Or is it going to be something different? So have we actually solved the problems that trap us? And so
No, we haven't. But I
Right.
think that what the frame of the story offers is an opportunity to actually write a new myth of the future. Because if
That's
you
right.
assume, so the idea that the rise of alien narratives coincides to the rise of scientific narratives seems transparently a symbol of the new mythological frame that's kind of sweeping over the minds of the people. We have,
Yeah.
and
This new
so,
religion.
yes, a new religion of sorts. And so, if we assume that it isn't real, right? Because if it was real, you would expect that you would have these stories going all the way back into the beginning of time. And you can say that perhaps there were stories because there's, mythological creatures, fairies, ogres, trolls, stories in Europe and Africa and China, like they all contain these mythological creatures that interact with humans somehow and dispense pieces of knowledge and wisdom. But the form of the alien is the new form of it being this cosmic thing that is outside of the planet rather than here emerging from the natural world. And so I think that we can safely assume that it is a transmutation of an old experience that we have had onto a new context.
Right. And there's something really important here that I think you're getting to, but that is central and makes it different from every story in our past, every single one, is that aliens are outside of humanity if they come from cosmos and above. Whereas before, angels were part of our evolution and part of humanity. And this is the magic trick. This is the big bad at the end by swapping out aliens for angels, is that you remove human agency from themselves in a sense. It can make us feel helpless. And so I think that in a sense where you can always bargain with your past, but you can't bargain with something that you don't understand from the future, from the sky. And I want to kind of illustrate this by if there's no real truth at the end of the road that I'm getting there. But so two things. First of all, is invoking this idea of cycles and still having the same kind of confrontations over and over, but having new agents introduced to her get somewhere new, right? So if this is kind of human evolution, and then we have these stories, right? We have this mythology and these stories that help us prepare or understand what's going on with these cycles. And so these stories are really important to us because it kind of gives us a should. And so if we adopt an alien should versus an angel should, or how these things play out will look different, right? It's not, I like to say that when the founding fathers wrote about America, they would, in some of their letters, say that there was a squirrel could go from Florida to the Northeast with never touching the ground, implying it was so heavily forested, right? So what do we learn from this is that the stories that the people told in North America caused them to not cut down the trees in a way that's different from when the stories that the Europeans told themselves when they came here did lead to this. And I'm not here to say that's good or bad. I'm just saying that the stories that we tell our children matter for how we grow up, right? And so the strange thing about these idea of stories and mythology now comes to this concept of shared human past and shared human stories. And in the esoteric realm, this definitely involves Atlantis, right? And so all of these mystics talk about this concept of Atlantis and predating our civilization now. And it's not I'm not jazzed, and none of them are jazz we talking about. It just seems this necessary thing. But what this starts to lead to is this one possibility that's kind of interesting, and I think fits a lot of the data. But again, this isn't the truth that I care about, right? I'm doing water research. This stuff is fun on the side and kind of gives some meaning, but it's not what I do every day. But
I don't know. Atlantis and water research seem like they could have deep common ground.
It's fair. It's fair. All roads lead to Atlantis. Who am I kidding? Right. So what Atlantis represents in this human story I'm talking about is this previous fall from grace, this previous Promethean playing with fire, becoming technologically advanced, God becoming unhappy, and then smiting you off the face of the earth, right? And so in a sense, this is this big epicycle. But now there's this more practical material detail, is that you have this now idea of Atlantis is going to fall. There's going to be humans like that are going to fracture into different groups, and some carry on the concepts from Atlantis. And some of these could be considered mystery schools, right? They carry some tradition and some secrets, and they might even carry some technology from them. And so through different, like, again, talking about like Mesoamerican civilizations, this concept of like Quetzalcoatl coming out and rebooting civilization, or giving technology like farming, this becomes a little bit, in a sense, it fits this lens or model well, where there is kind of a leftover class of people who remember Atlantis with access to some information technology. So there's people that live on the surface, but what if the group of this decides to live underground? And what's interesting about living underground is that now, as if you're cut off from the sun, and this is biblically relevant and strange, right? So if you're cut off from the sun, what happens to you naturally? You start to lose skin pigmentation and get big eyes, right? This looks kind of like a gray. On the same token, it represents like mystically no longer getting energy from the sun. So in a sense, if sun and all, Promethean figures fire, it's always this, the organic life path that Steiner lays out is always one that's like in line and cyclical with the sun. So you start to cut yourself off from the sun and start to like evolve underground, and with this high technology. And I'm arguing that what the Greys are is an evolved human from Atlantis that chose a transhuman approach. So metaphorically, in the story that we care about, is the gray alien represents the transhuman path and what that looks like if you evolve down that way, and getting rid of that. And so then the practical application here is that maybe some of the like strange things that we view, or these like alien abductions, are these gray aliens. And what they aren't is they are not aliens. They were once human who then did this work on themselves. So it is in the best interest, if they wish to gain control over humans, to have them believe a incorrect origin story, right? And so this is the big bad. This is the thing to be worried about at the end of the day, is that a religion will be like put onto humanity that has aliens as these messiah characters, when really it's actually our past that we're still grappling with, is the metaphor, right? To be worried about. And this is kind of at the base of a lot of the esoteric Christianity stuff.
I mean, this neatly wraps, I think, to where I was trying to get to before we brought Atlantis into it, which is the fact that if you have the narrative of the alien as the other, then you do have this fracture, and it is this truly unique story in the entirety of human history. But what I was going to say is, I was like, it also offers us this blank canvas on which to write a new kind of mythology. And it seems like that's what you're pointing to, which is the fact that there is this open space that hasn't been filled with established lore yet.
Yeah, because I guess you could imagine aliens that were the best versions of us as well, which is more like the angelic approach. But it is as a blank canvas. I hear you, that there is the opportunity to write that story in as well, which aren't the sort of like show up in shiny phalluses and rape you kind of aliens, but they're, actually what we imagine. And it's our
weird looking phallus, if I'm thinking about the same UFOs.
I think they were all like cigar shaped back in the 50s when people first started identifying them. This is something.
There's a lot of discs as well. It's kind of interesting to watch the
maybe they're just like two parts of the same kind of ship, and
little shorties.
Yeah, little shorties.
That's good.
So,
but it does look, to your point from before, Shiloh, it's clear that we need some kind of novel mythological structure. It's also clear that mythological structures tend to coalesce into some sort of unified form over a long enough period of power vacuum, where there's some old way of seeing things. That old way starts to lose its hold on the population. All of these different things rise out of the ground that's kind of maybe a remix of old ideas and some new ideas thrown in. That gets refined into something that has the greatest amount of staying power, and then we have 1,300 years of the church basically being in control of everything. Until it's not. And now we're in this moment where the new mythology is being born, and you're like, what is the symbolism of that new mythology? And I think that it is terribly disappointing to look out onto the future and to be like, God, I think it might be aliens.
Yeah, well, I think that we can do better than that. I think it's an okay canvas, but I guess one of the things I would be remiss if I didn't mention before this podcast closed down is, and I kind of alluded to this earlier with the Gnostic sects, but you can go and trace the history of Judaism back to the Canaanite religions, and you see the same thing. And this is somebody we've been looking for. We've been looking for an expert scholar who studies this, but it's the loss of the feminine perspective and the feminine consort in major world religions over the past few millennia, which the Sophia, exactly. And so I would certainly be looking to include the other half of the planet in whatever mythological structures emerge in the new future that binds us together spiritually. Because I feel like that's been a terrible failure, actually, is that, yeah, like and this is one of the reasons why I don't want the old world religions to win the culture war either, is because I feel like they're inadequate, right? There has been a revolution, and perhaps there's been all sorts of second, third order effects that have been really terrible of women moving into different roles. Like, it hasn't been accounted for or dealt with in terms of a woven structure that is balanced in a very healthy way. But there hasn't been a place for that feminine perspective in the traditional religions. And I would fully expect that should be a piece of the central mythology going forward. And of course, the Grayling thing tries to remove gender from the discussion altogether, right, which again, I think makes it silly and not the right way to go. But I guess I don't know what the next symbolic structure is. I'm searching for it. I'm trying to understand it. Maybe I'm trying to predict it. Maybe I'm trying to usher it in. But I think we all need something that we can hold on to. And that concept of God worked really well for a long time. And it's not clear to me that we can get by without something like that.
And so for me,
I just want to add something really quickly to that. Like, I think that it's really interesting where as we become more and more technologically imbued, looking just to the natural world as the only place from which we draw inspiration also feels deeply limited, because I've kind of grown to see the idea of God as being the embodiment of the entire universe acting as one. It's this kind of distributed shape of things.
Spinoza.
Yeah, it's very Spinozan.
Right. And that's kind of the thing that I kind of want to pick up on, was that part of my not really entering into this information in the first place for years was I'd always thought of God as this like character that's omniscient, omnipresent, everything. And I'd never like met or trust or like really want to interact with a character like that. Just seems very strange. But what has been nice about how Steiner proposes his cosmology is that God becomes an ecosystem. So when he's talking about spiritual hierarchy or spiritual economy, it truly is how the different characters in the universe interact with each other and the natural order of what that should look like. So there isn't necessarily, right, like Steiner talks about a war in heaven, right? How would like one omniscient dude like fight himself? Clearly, as with any ecosystem, there's political parties with desires and values that are, trying to figure it out. Very relatable, right? And so this is a much like easier concept for me to understand of God, where there is this ecosystem and you give and take, and there's a healthy way to do this. And so one of the ways I like to illustrate this is kind of like cancer is a cell in your body that decides it doesn't want to die, right? And so it just continues to replicate and it pollutes the environment because it wants to exercise this individuality in a way that causes the whole organism to fail and you die as well. And so in a sense, a healthy functioning ecosystem involves all of my cells kind of like paying attention to me, not trying to go off and do their own thing. And at the same time, for me to have a healthy functioning ecosystem, I have to pay attention to my cells. I have to feed them appropriately, rest them. We're doing this together. And so it all comes out when we're like paying attention to everyone. But then we imagine this like technology, and it has this like cancerous effects, right? We start to really promote individuality in an unhealthy way, where it just literally leads to pollution of the environment. And so whether we're wasting fossil fuels for things like, knickknacks and tchotchkes we don't need, or any of these things, like there's a consequence to this wasted effort where people are trying to, take care of themselves, get their paycheck, right? Their paycheck at like what cost to the world. And that's what we're really waking up now, is not so much the concept of like God is an omniscient person to follow like a messiah, but God is this ecosystem that we're participating in, that we have a vote in, and that we have some actual power. And so it's trying to embody, figure out how to have that conversation with itself. And so Steiner points to science as being this like tool where you should be like follow science to a logical end where spirit kind of comes out naturally. And this is kind of this interesting thing now where there's some strange like parallels where recently you guys have been talking a lot about low energy nuclear reactions. And I think that there's a lot of mysticism with the people that talk about this. And some of the things that they cite are like strange crystal structures that only happen during planetary alignments, right? And these things looks like astrology in a certain way, right? But there's a material basis for this. So in this sense, science has gotten so good at measuring, we've measured ourselves back into this problem, right? Of we get to examine the walls so closely that we're kind of pointed back towards this need for spirit. And so it said spiritual science is this invitation to rigorize these systems, right? To approach it in a scientific manner. So for us all to agree on God and move together in the same direction, not only do we need the concept of God that we can agree on, we also need like an objective way to flesh that out, right? Because right now, this is kind of a thing where we don't really have objective things. We give space for people to share what they believe. That's great and how it should be, right? But we haven't, everyone kind of, religion's this thing where what anyone says goes. And Steiner points to this having to change, for it having to become rigorized like science, where there are these systems that he poses and points our attention to, and that they can be interpreted in different ways, and that this is can be systematized. So if this balancing approach going forward, kind of invoking this like Christ principle, where we've been kind of deluded to think that we're headed towards heaven or hell, this like trick is actually we should be kind of on, as Steiner puts it, Christ is the middle path of balancing these two extremes. So I think that these simple reformatings, we get to then just become much more aware of the ecosystem that we live in, and that what we do has impacts somewhere else. And this will slowly start to, I think, reformat how we approach problems and what we're trying to gain from them and what we're trying to do. And that this is like a necessary part of our evolution for the next step out here. And we don't exactly know what this takes or what this looks like. But some things that we do know is, as we talked today, is the danger of Messiah, right? The danger of outsourcing your power to someone else and listening to them. So clearly, part of what is going on is to then be really, really internally reliant on your own systems, your own feelings, doing what you need to be doing. And ideally, what you need to be doing should contribute to the ecosystem, or otherwise you're cancer, right? If you're just selfishly doing what you want to do, polluting the world around you at no cost, then this effectively looks like building a rocket at any cost to the environment and leaving, right? For those other people to deal with the waste that you leave behind. So there are these metaphors. Yeah.
I think there is I think I love the participatory element of this future symbolic structure. And also this idea of a common denominator. And I think it's not a lowest common denominator, it's a highest common denominator, right? There are elements, I think, if you just walk down the street and just sample random people in our civilization, there are highest common denominators, and those are what have to be centralized. And to some extent, the old world religions have done a pretty good job with some of that. But I feel like the world has changed so insanely in the last even just 10 years, and it's, this, who knows how long it will keep accelerating, that we have to really stretch our imaginations for how to wrap in those common denominators with that changing ecosystem.
It's really interesting because after this entire discussion, I'm still not sold on something that you said, which is the fact that we should be wary of the idea of the Messiah. Because I don't think that humans are evolved or meant to function without some kind of external frame for what to aim for, and without a representation or an embodiment of that frame. And so, I don't know, maybe we can pick this up again later, because I think this opens up an entire 3-hour can of worms. But I'm not sure that it's possible for humans to tell stories without there being a central character.
Yeah, if you want to like dig into this in an interesting way, this is what J.R.R. Tolkien and Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, severely disagreed and butt heads with. Because Tolkien is effectively telling a story of esoteric Christianity, and he is also educated in this, and in a sense purposely doing this. and there's Messiah and saviors there. And Frank Herbert writes Dune as a warning, right? The entire purpose of the series is to warn against Messiah figures, and is the point of Paul is to be the first book is getting caught up in this perfect story of this perfect character going through and like doing all things, and then the rest of the books is kind of like unwinding how that all went wrong and that like led to some horrible outcomes. And so I think that you're right, like that is the right thing to push back on, and it's also a very like deep and long story in our history as well. People have really struggled with shedding a Messiah.
I have not
What a
read.
pair of messiahs.
No, I like the pair of Messiahs, the hero twins. I haven't read Dune or Lord of the Rings in a really long time, and it would be interesting to revisit them with the benefit of the intervening decades.
Yeah, and I believe Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and Steinerian stuff was kind of, they were all part of the same circles in some sense.
Absolutely were. There's this thing called the Orphic Circle, and so earlier we
That's it.
talked about how the ruling class would always have their prophets and next nearby. So in like the late 1800s, early 1900s, there's this rumors and evidence of this Orphic Circle where they would do seances with young people, and so like Alice in Wonderland is a retelling of stories that come through this medium, right? Is the zeitgeist of what this was. And so strangely, the Orphic Circle does connect a lot of characters, and including like the Vril Society, right, seems to be somehow connected to stories that come from this. And yeah, very, very deep stuff there also about like underground creatures and kingdoms, things like that.
I love this so much.
Let's stay out of that rabbit hole for right now.
Yeah.
But just for right now, I mean, I think that there's a lot of ground still left to cover here, because it's obviously not a question that's been settled.
And I think I personally think it's the most important question in the entire universe.
He literally says that at least once a day.
Yeah, I've just been completely obsessed. I'm lying awake thinking about this. So.
And I like agree at my heart too, right? I'm so glad I get to talk about my water research, and that's my work every day, right? But these are the stories that gave me a lot of meaning, that helped me actually like rigorize my water work. And it's strange how that happens, but I do agree that these are the important kind of stories to give ourselves the meaning, the should of what we should be doing. And what's cool is that the story, like I talk about Steiner's cosmology and his view in esoteric Christianity. This is not just stuck to esoteric Christianity. There's an esoteric version of every religion, and all of them. And if you read the main text, they all have these same themes over and over and over. So if you learn one deeply, it gives you the tools to interface with almost any other human story, because you see the same kind of Jungian archetypes, throughout
That's really
them.
interesting.
So yeah, and of course, like where you pay attention slightly changes the meaning, right? Again, for example, Judaism is waiting for their Messiah, whereas Christianity has already had them. So when Avi Loeb is invoking the idea of a Messiah, it might be different than as someone who learned from Christian scripture growing up. Yeah, how they would talk about it, right? So they're not all the same, but they do all come from like the same source material, and sometimes differ a little bit about what they highlight as important. Yeah,
Wow.
but these are really powerful tools for not just interfacing with ourselves, but also with our history. And I think that's really like, we never want to be disconnected from our history, right? A cancer cell is a cell that forgets what it's doing, what tissue it's part of, and becomes something else.
I have so many more things to say. Let's just put a pin in it, and let's do another one of these in another couple of weeks, because I want to read Dune and Lord of the Rings again, and then maybe we can use that as the starting point. Maybe we
I
can.
want to watch the new Dune too. Isn't there a new Dune?
There is
version?
a new Dune.
Is
yeah.
the music as good as the first one?
No,
It's pretty
No.
sick.
and it
It is
isn't-
pretty sick. All right, hell
It's
yeah.
not
Let's
directed
go.
by David Lynch. It can't be it'll
Really?
never be as weird and strange and beautiful as the first one. Didn't David Lynch do the first Dune?
Yeah, there's too many Dunes. I was confused. So there's the first Dune by David Lynch. There's a sci-fi series of Dune that no one remembers or talks about, and then there's the Denis Villeneuve series.
Yeah, if people haven't seen the first Dune, it's a completely ecstatic experience that I would highly recommend to anyone. Watch it with friends. Don't watch it alone in the dark.
Hey, before you go, man, public congrats on publishing your water magnum opus. I know we didn't talk about your actual science today, but maybe we should circle back on that at a upcoming
Thank you
date.
so much.
Yeah, so
And-
I'll just go ahead and link that down below too if anybody wants to follow. Is it published now? It's out, right?
It's totally out. So I am finished with it. I literally cannot change it if I want to. It's out. The actual journal that it's printed on in the material world hasn't come out yet, but it's available online. It's public access, so it's all free. Humongous thanks to both of you for reading and the feedback. I got a chance to rewrite it almost entirely from when you guys read it, and it's so much better. And also, shout out to your viewers. When I talked about it last and then linked it, my article became one of the top 10 downloaded biochemistry articles on this preprint server within the past 60 days. So that was really
That's
cool.
really
So,
amazing.
Moving mountains.
Driving that.
Oh,
So
yeah.
big thanks to the community for helping me get here. I'm really proud of this paper. Really excited for it to be out.
It is
Absolutely.
an extraordinary piece of work. It just basically has all of the framework in it, all of the examples,
I
all of
try
the
and low key,
structures.
I think about biochemistry so differently from when I went to school, and so this paper is my attempt to take someone who's been doing biochemistry for 10 years, and through like this one paper, I can reform how everything exists and talks to each other, and what the shoulds are, right? Biochemistry.
That's fantastic.
From a
Yeah, man, and
perspective.
thanks for being such a pillar of our own community too. It's really awesome. Michael's showing up to our patron chats every Sunday. He's been really helping us move paradigm drift in the right direction, and that's pretty admirable, man. Because you're not really getting anything out of that.
Except for downloads.
We're all trying to move the world in the way that we like to, but it's fun. You guys have made a great community. It's a lot of fun. I like that we get to do this cool stuff here. And so thanks for making that space. I love contributing to what you guys are up to with this project.
Nice. And I'm going to take the opportunity to announce that I'm starting to scheme on a DemystifySci camping trip. And so we rent basically like a Boy Scout camp, and everybody camps in the cabins. And then it'll be community driven, where instead of hiring speakers to come out, we'll give the schedule open to people to sign up to give little talks and host events. I think it's going to be really good.
We'll still do the nerdy conferences, but we need some counterbalance to that, I think, where people can just full-time hang out.
And just go swimming in the lake and roast marshmallows or whatever it is that people want to do.
We don't know where we gotta be, so we gotta experiment to figure out what it is. And roasting marshmallows is a great part of experimentation. So yeah.
Shiloh will roast
keto-friendly.
Yeah, Shiloh will be roasting squirrels.
Tasty.
All right, Michael. We'll let you get on with your day, man. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
It's really good seeing you.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.